Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, November 1876. Midnight. The cold had teeth. Outside, the valley lay locked under a killing cold snap, the kind old trappers measured not with thermometers, but with dead cattle and blackened toes. The snow squeaked under boots like broken glass. Breath hung in the air and froze to beards in stiff white fans. Out here, with temperatures plunging well below zero, winter wasn't a season. It was a verdict. In most cabins, the verdict was already coming due. Samuel Creek's place, a standard single-wall log cabin his family had built in these mountains for 2 generations, groaned in the wind. Frost rimmed the wool blankets hanging over the bed. Ice traced delicate white ferns across the inside of the tiny window panes. His youngest boy slept with a scarf over his nose to keep it from freezing, and still his teeth chattered. The stove roared red, eating through split pine as if the forest were endless. This was normal. This was frontier life. 2 cabins down the draw, William Thorpe jammed another armload of wood into a cast-iron stove, so hot the lid glowed faintly. His wife wrapped rags around the children's feet, checking for the waxy sheen that meant frostbite. Men in this valley didn't sleep through a night like this. They took shifts, feeding the fire, listening to the wind probe every crack in the wall, praying the livestock would still be alive at dawn. And then there was Jacob Reinhardt's cabin. From the outside, it looked wrong. The stovepipe was thin, almost delicate, smoking less than half of his neighbors. The log walls were doubled with a strange, heavy-looking thickness, and visible gaps you could literally see daylight through near the eaves. No extra quilts tacked to the interior, no desperate layers of canvas. According to every expert in the valley, that cabin should have been bleeding heat into the night. But step inside, and the rules fell apart. Jacob sat at a rough plank table in nothing but a shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. On the stove, coffee still steamed in a tin pot, though the fire itself had slumped to lazy orange coals hours before. His breath barely fogged the air. The log walls felt warm to the touch, not blazing, not hot, but radiating a slow, steady comfort that wrapped the single room like a wool coat. Outside, a horse in the creek corral shivered under a crust of rime, ribs showing, every exhale a desperate plume in the dark. Chickens in Thorpe's shed huddled together, some already stiff on the straw. Livestock were dying in this cold. Children were one bad draft away from frostbite. Men were burning through their winter woodpile in weeks. Jacob was sleeping. No midnight tending. No frantic feeding of the stove. Just a stubborn, quiet mountain man in a shirt, stretched out under a single blanket in a cabin that ignored every rule his neighbors had followed, and yet stayed the warmest on the ridge. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat, walls, and winter that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to see why his thin stove, his strange double walls, and those wrong gaps in his cabin weren't mistakes at all, but knowledge that's been buried for over a century. And in weather like this, the difference between survival and catastrophe. Now let's see what Jacob built. Snow fell in dry, hissing sheets the night the argument turned into an experiment. Wind clawed down off the Bridger Mountains, rattling shutters and reminding every cabin whose side winter was on. Samuel Creek had had enough of the campfire rumors. Jacob's thin-walled cabin, his toy stove, his claim that he could read by lamplight in his shirt sleeves while his neighbors slept in coats. So Samuel did what a practical man does. He reached for numbers. He took down his brass thermometer from the nail beside his door. Frontier hardware, not fancy science. The glass tube was clouded at the top, the scale worn where calloused thumbs had rubbed it for years. He muttered that he'd settle this nonsense, wrapped his scarf tight, and stepped into the night. When Samuel crossed his own threshold to take the first reading, the contrast hit him. This was his cabin, built by the book. Single log wall, moss and mud chinking, big iron stove roaring in the corner. Yet, 15 feet from the fire, near the bed where his children slept, the breath from his lips hung in the air like pipe smoke. He hung the thermometer on a peg at shoulder height, away from the stove's glare, and waited. The mercury crept, then stalled. 34, 35, 36 degrees Fahrenheit. That was it. The floorboards under his boots felt like packed ice. A faint thread of air slid around his ankles, a silent river of cold draining toward every crack in the wall. This was normal. This was frontier life. But standing there, watching his own breath, Samuel suddenly understood why everyone whispered about Jacob. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the rest of them did not? He yanked the thermometer down, shoved it in his coat, and trudged across the frozen yard toward Jacob's place. Snow squeaked under his weight. The wind cut sideways, but halfway there he noticed something strange. Jacob's stovepipe wasn't belching like a locomotive, just a thin gray thread of smoke against the black sky. Inside Jacob's cabin, the air hit him like a different season. Not hot, just calm. Still, warm. He shut the door and realized he could no longer hear the wind. Samuel's boots thudded on the floorboards, and he stopped. No icy bite through the soles, no invisible river of cold around his ankles. The walls themselves seemed to glow with a low, even heat, as if the cabin had swallowed the day's fire and was quietly giving it back. He hung the same brass thermometer on Jacob's inner wall, away from the small stove that ticked lazily in the corner. They watched. 48, 58, 64. The mercury climbed, then eased to a stop near 68 degrees. 68, on a night when his own cabin could barely scrape 36. Samuel's eyes flicked to the woodpile. Jacob had burned through maybe half a stack by early January. The other neighbors? Their yards looked like chewed bones, great cords of timber already vanished into smoke. Before we reveal the exact technique, pause on that image. Same winter, same valley, same wind. One cabin at 68 with a lazy fire and fat woodpile. Another at 36 with a raging stove and a yard gone bare. Samuel ran his hand along Jacob's wall. It wasn't thick the way a man was taught a proper wall should be. There were seams, lines, a sense of layers and hidden weight. No drafts at his feet, no frost rime in the corners. Just that steady, impossible warmth. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century was pressed into those walls, and Samuel could feel it without knowing the words for conduction, convection, or thermal mass. The numbers in his hand said the cabin was nearly 30 degrees warmer. The lessons in his head said this construction was wrong. He stepped back into the doorway, thermometer cold in his palm, and stared at Jacob's strange double wall like it was a loaded rifle pointed at everything he'd been taught. If a cabin that broke the rules could beat the cold this badly, what else about heat, walls, and winter had they been getting wrong? He wasn't just staring at a warm cabin. He was staring at a question that should make you a little uncomfortable too. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat, walls, and winter that 2 full generations of frontier builders and a shocking number of modern contractors still overlook? Because out in those mountains, comfort wasn't a luxury. It was the difference between survival and catastrophe. For 50 years in that valley, cabins had been built the same way. Single log wall, moss and mud in the gaps. Maybe a layer of boards if you had cash and time. People froze at 38 degrees inside and called it cozy. Children slept in hats. Water buckets skimmed with ice by morning. This was normal. This was frontier life. Nobody questioned the pattern. The suffering was baked into the design. If you were cold, you were told to burn more wood, plug more cracks, nail on more boards. The idea that the wall itself could be wrong, that the way heat moved through wood, stone, and air might be the real enemy, that didn't even enter the conversation. Then the winter of 1876-77 hit, and the territory got handed an unplanned experiment. Same valley, same wind, same snow. Cabins within riding distance of each other. The only major variable? One German immigrant who had built a double wall full of stone that everyone said was foolish. Before we reveal the exact technique, understand what that winter turned into. Night after night near 22 degrees. Wind that drove the chill to 45 degrees. In the proper cabins, indoor temperatures clawed their way to the mid-40s with the stove roaring and fell toward freezing the moment the fire died. Frost crept across inside walls. Breath hung in the air. Firewood piles vanished at nearly 3 cords a week. Jacob's cabin told a different story. Evenings in the mid-60s. Mornings still in the 50s with cold ashes in the stove. Half the wood gone from his stack compared to his neighbors. No frost on the inner wall. No children waking to see their breath. Same winter. Same valley. Completely different outcome. So what was actually happening inside those walls? Why did a cabin with a smaller stove, a heavy stone core, and even a few visible gaps stay warm when tighter, better insulated cabins stayed clammy and cold? Here's the part modern insulation brochures rarely explain clearly. Jacob was using thermal mass, controlled leaks, and the physics of radiant heat long before those words showed up in codebooks. He'd built a cabin that didn't just resist the cold, it stored heat like a battery, released it slowly, and let just enough air move to stay dry instead of damp. Now, let's see what Jacob built, stone by stone and log by log, and why those choices still outperform a lot of pink fiberglass and plastic today. Jacob never drew a blueprint. There are no tidy diagrams, no engineer stamp, no handwritten notes labeled Thermal Mass Experiment 1876. There's only a cabin that refused to behave the way a proper frontier cabin was supposed to behave, and a trail of neighbors' stories that sound almost embarrassed to admit how well it worked. One neighbor remembered taking off his coat inside Jacob's place while his own children slept in hats and mittens. Another recalled that his coffee was still warm in the morning, while their own water buckets skinned over with ice by dawn. No plans, no manifesto, just a stubborn mountain man, a double log wall, and a winter that should have exposed every weakness. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that the catalog plans, the army forts, and the railroad bunkhouses all missed? That question matters, because his problem is still your problem. Today, it just hides behind drywall. You see it in drafty mountain chalets with huge picture windows and code-approved insulation that still feel chilly at the same thermostat setting. You see it in over-insulated tiny homes that technically meet our values on paper, but feel cold and clammy, as if the walls are sweating while you shiver. You see it in brand new houses where the furnace cycles all night, the bills climb, and yet the air near the floor still bites your ankles in January. On paper, those buildings work. In real mountains, in real cold, they quietly fail in the same way Jacob's neighbors' cabins failed. Thin walls by thermal standards, light on mass, heavy on air, leaks in the wrong places, and obsessed with insulation while ignoring where the heat actually goes. This episode is about turning Jacob's forgotten cabin into a hidden blueprint for warmth. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century, pulled out log by log and stone by stone, and translated into physics you can actually use. You're going to see exactly how his walls were built, why 8,000 pounds of stone behind timber changed the way heat moved, and how the same principles show up today in Scandinavian log homes, earthships half buried in desert hillsides, and off-grid cabins that ride out blizzards with a single small stove. We're not here to romanticize the past or pretend every log in 1876 was magical. Jacob's cabin earned its reputation in the coldest winter in 40 years, when that difference between survival and catastrophe wasn't theoretical. It stayed warm with less fuel, less effort, and more comfort. That is design worth reverse engineering. Before we reveal the exact technique, we're going to pull apart the assumptions behind normal cabin construction. Why standard stud walls, fluffy insulation, and plastic vapor barriers can trap moisture, create cold corners, and leave you shivering in a room that a thermostat swears is 70 degrees. Why airtight is not the same as warm. And why, in real mountain climates, the rules you've been told to follow can quietly bleed heat all winter long. Once you see those failures in slow motion, Jacob's strange double wall will stop looking crazy. It will look inevitable. Once you see those failures in slow motion, Jacob's strange double wall will stop looking crazy. It will look inevitable. And it will stop feeling like a museum curiosity in the Montana mountains, and start feeling uncomfortably close to your own house. Because you don't live in an 1876 cabin. You live with gas bills, electric heat, mini splits, fiberglass bats, spray foam, and a thermostat that insists everything is fine while your toes say otherwise. One room is hot, the hallway is cold, the north bedroom never quite warms up in winter. You add more insulation, you tape more seams, and the meter still spins. On paper, the R values look great. The charts say your walls are thick enough, your attic is loaded, your windows meet code. But those charts were written for flat laboratory conditions, not for a real January night with wind hammering one side of the house and bone-dry air sucking moisture out of everything. In that world, the way heat actually moves through your walls matters more than the number printed on a roll of insulation. Standard stud walls are light and hollow. Heat rushes through the cavities by convection, rides the studs by conduction, and leaks at every little gap in the sheathing. In a calm suburb, that might be acceptable. In a windy valley, or at 7,000 feet, that same wall can feel like it's quietly bleeding heat all winter long. The result is that familiar modern misery: 70 degrees on the thermostat, 63 degrees in your bones. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that our charts keep missing? He understood that comfort is not only about how fast heat escapes, but about how steadily a space gives that heat back to you. He built a cabin where dense stone and heavy wood slowed the swings, where the wall itself became a reservoir instead of a paper-thin barrier. Before we reveal the exact technique, know this: you do not need to rebuild your house out of Riverstone to steal Jacob's advantage. By the end of this video, you'll know where adding a bit of mass actually matters, how to tame those invisible convective loops that strip heat out of your walls, and how to let low winter sun quietly charge the heavy surfaces you already have. These are small, targeted tweaks: placing a bookshelf, thickening a particular interior wall, baffling a leaky cavity that can translate into real degrees of warmth. And here's the truly contrarian part: many of the warmest, coziest structures on Earth technically break modern insulation rules. Thick earthen homes with no plastic vapor barrier, stone farmhouses with single glazing, high alpine lodges that leak just enough air to stay dry yet feel warm. On paper, some of them lose. In lived winter, they win. We're about to freeze Jacob's story at the most critical moment, the day he stacked his second log wall and started pouring stone into the gap. Right on that strange, rule-breaking decision, we're going to pause and ask you for something. Before we show you exactly how that wall was built, layer by layer, so freeze the frame right here. Jacob's standing in the half-built cabin, that first inner log wall already stacked waist-high. And then, against every rule his neighbors swore by, he starts laying a second wall 18 inches away, leaving a gap big enough to swallow a man's arm. This is the moment we're going to dissect, because this is where the cabin stopped being just logs and quietly turned into a machine for controlling heat. Before we reveal the exact technique, I want to ask you for something simple that genuinely helps bring this kind of buried knowledge back. If you're into seeing how a scruffy cabin in the Montana mountains can outperform a modern insulated house, hit like right now. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest of Jacob's story, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what winter feels like where you live. Is it wet and bone deep? Dry and razor sharp? Do your walls ever feel colder than the thermostat says they should? Because what Jacob built here is not just a weird double wall. It's an 18-inch thermal battery running all the way around his cabin. In the next segment, we're going to slow down and give you the exact numbers, how thick each log course really was, why that 18-inch gap wasn't random, and how filling it with roughly 8,000 pounds of stone changed everything about how the cabin stored and released heat into the room. Now, let's see what Jacob built compared to what you've probably been sold. Modern marketing loves fluffy R values, fiberglass bats, spray foam, perfect plastic vapor barriers. You're told that if the R number is high enough, your cabin will feel warm. But you've probably had that strange experience. The thermostat reads 70 degrees, and the room still feels cold, the walls almost radiating chill at you. Why? What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen and a century of insulation brochures missed? He leaned by instinct into thermal mass construction. Dense material, slow response. Walls that don't just block heat loss, but actually hold heat and give it back long after the fire dies. We're going to walk you through why that 18-inch stone-filled cavity let gentle convection wash past the rock without turning into a draft, how the outer log wall acted like a shield, and how those particular riverstones and sandstones, chosen for density, not looks, let his cabin stay warm even as the fire went out and the night dropped toward 22 degrees. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century under pink bats and glossy brochures. Stay with this story, because in the next section we'll turn Jacob's crazy wall into clear numbers and simple diagrams you can apply to your own 4 walls, even if you never stack a single log. And then we're back in 1876. The pink bats and glossy brochures dissolve, and you hear it instead. Iron on frozen bark, the hollow ring of an axe biting spruce. Sled runners rasp over first frost. In the shadow of the Bridger Mountains, early autumn is already a warning, not a season. Men hurry. You can see it in the way they throw up cabins, single log wall, quick notches, moss and mud jammed into the gaps. 4 walls, a roof, a stove. Done. This was normal. This was frontier life. Get something between you and the cold before winter lands for real. Jacob Reinhardt is not hurrying. While his neighbors race to finish thin-walled boxes, Jacob is down in the creek bed, levering stone into a sled until the runners complain. He's digging deeper for a foundation, while the others are already hanging doors. They call across the clearing, half joking, half annoyed. "Reinhardt, you building a cabin or a fort?" They're not wrong. He is building a fortress. Not with battlements and rifles, but with mass and distance. With a double wall and 8,000 pounds of river stone. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of American frontiersmen had overlooked? He'd watched, that's all. Years of 3 a.m. visits to sick neighbors, boots crunching in the snow, stepping into cabins where the fire had died and the air sat at 38 degrees. Frost on the inside of the logs. Children coughing under quilts. And then, in the same valley, he'd stepped into root cellars and stone barns that felt strangely warm, or at least not killingly cold, even with no fire at all. So while everyone else trusted what had been built for 2 generations, Jacob trusted what stayed warmest when no one was looking. Before we reveal the exact technique, see the contrast. Their walls were thin, fast, and familiar. His walls were slow, heavy, and, in their words, stupid. He stacks an inner log wall, then 18 inches away, an outer wall, the gap between them waiting like an empty trench. His neighbors shake their heads. That's twice the logs for 1 cabin, twice the chinking, twice the work. In a Montana winter, where 20 is a Tuesday, that looks like madness. pattern interrupt. Jacob isn't trying to be clever. He's trying to be humble before physics. He isn't copying catalog plans. There are no glossy diagrams out here. He's copying the way earth and stone behave when the wind can't touch them. He's seen how a banked-in dugout, half buried in the hill, never swings as wildly in temperature as a proud, square cabin on stilts. He's felt the way a thick stone wall in town gives back the day's heat long after sunset, while thin board houses go cold by supper. Now, let's see what Jacob built in that gap the others called wasted space. Because that 18 inches of nothing is about to become the difference between survival and catastrophe when the real winter hits. Out in the rest of the valley, that wasted space didn't exist. A normal cabin wall was one decision. Logs, big ones if you were lucky, smaller if you were tired, notched and stacked in a hurry before the first real snow came down out of the mountains. Standard Montana cabins in 1876 used single-wall construction. Logs notched and locked at the corners, the gaps between them crammed with mud, straw, moss, maybe a little horsehair if you were fancy. On the inside, if a man had extra time or boards, he might tack up a thin layer of planks to make it look finished. That was the whole thermal strategy. Heat came from a squat iron stove or a rough stone fireplace. You burned pine, fir, whatever you could drag in on a sled, and when the fire roared, the corner of the cabin near that stove felt almost civilized. Your hands thawed, your face flushed. You could peel off one layer. Take 3 steps back, though, and the illusion shattered. You felt the drafts first. Tiny threads of air sneaking through the chinking, sliding along the floor, wrapping around your ankles like cold water. On bad nights, you could actually hear it. Wind whistling through hairline cracks, a high needling sound that never quite stopped. The walls themselves radiated cold. Lean your back against a log, and it was like pressing against packed snow. By midnight, frost would bloom on nail heads and around the edges of window frames. Tin plates stacked by the wall grew a thin skin of ice. In more than one cabin, children scratched their names into the frost on the inside of the glass before bed. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of American frontiersmen had overlooked? Start with the numbers. In a typical neighbor's cabin, you could drive the air near the stove to 60, even 65 degrees if you fed it hard. But kill the fire, and the clock started. Within 2 hours, that same space slid most of the way back toward the outdoor temperature. By dawn, with 10-degree bias outside, the inside might be scraping just above freezing, sometimes below. Breath smoked in the air. Water buckets froze solid. Indoors. This was normal. This was frontier winter. People slept in wool caps and mittens under heavy quilts. They broke ice in the wash basin each morning. They woke every 2 or 3 hours to throw in more wood, not because they wanted to, but because failing to do it was the difference between survival and catastrophe for the very young and the very old. Even when progress arrived, lighter stud wall cabins with early insulation, sawdust, newspaper, maybe mineral wool, the problem never really left. Thin walls with big hollow cavities set up convective loops, little invisible rivers of air that stripped heat from the inside surface and ferried it straight outdoors. You got less obvious draft, more polite carpentry, and still woke up shivering. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, you need to feel how low the bar was. Because compared to these leaky single-wall cabins and their improved but still hungry cousins, what he built next looks like knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Modern building, on paper, looks nothing like those drafty frontier cabins. In theory, we fix the problem. In practice, you've probably still sat in a brand new mountain house and felt that thin, nagging chill around your ankles. Here's how the good wall is supposed to work. Carpenters stand up a forest of 2x4 or 2x6 studs, 16 inches on center, like a wooden rib cage. Outside, they nail on sheathing, OSB or plywood, then a weather barrier, then siding. Inside, they squeeze fiberglass bats or blow in fluffy insulation, staple up a plastic vapor barrier, and finish with drywall. Clean, straight, code approved. On the blueprint, that wall gets an R value, R13, R19, maybe R23 if your builder was feeling generous. R is resistance to heat flow under lab conditions. Steady temperatures, no wind, perfectly installed insulation, no moisture. It's a number that says, in a test box, this assembly slows heat loss by a certain amount. But a mountain winter is not a test box. Wind presses on one side of your cabin, sucks on the other, and those stud bays become little chimneys. Warm air inside the cavity rises, cold air sinks, and you get convective loops quietly stripping heat from the interior drywall. The fiberglass isn't moving, but the air is. Your R19 wall doesn't act like R19 anymore. It acts like a polite invitation for your expensive heat to go sightseeing. Then there are the studs themselves. Every 1.5-inch wide 2x6 is a wooden bridge from warm drywall to cold exterior sheathing. Wood insulates worse than the fluffy fill between it, so each stud is a thermal highway. Multiply that by dozens of studs, plates, and headers, and 20-25% of your wall area is a built-in leak. No gaps, no obvious draft, but the heat just walks out through the framing. To keep moisture out, we wrap the inside with plastic. That looks clever in a manual. In a real cabin, with real people cooking, breathing, drying boots by the stove, humidity rises. Some of that water vapor hits cold layers in the wall and condenses. Now your insulation is damp. Wet fibers conduct heat better, which in this case is worse. And the room starts to feel cold and clammy even when the thermostat claims 70 degrees. Contrast that with heavy, dense walls, old stone houses in the mountains, thick log cabins with real mass. They don't chase every R point, they tame temperature swings. When a blizzard slams through, a low-mass stud wall reacts fast, too fast. The interior surface cools sharply. Radiant heat leaves your skin, and you feel the cold long before the thermostat catches up. A stone or log wall moves slowly. It absorbs heat when the stove is roaring, then bleeds it back for hours, smoothing out those violent ups and downs. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, standing in that unfinished cabin, that our spreadsheets still miss? If our code-approved walls are so good by the numbers, why do modern mountain homes still have cold corners, icy windows, and that one room nobody wants in January? Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, we need to look at how he turned those heavy walls into a thermal battery the lab tests never saw coming. To see what Jacob really did, you have to watch how heat tries to escape a cabin in the first place. Not in theory, in the way you actually feel it on your skin on a January night in the mountains. There are only 3 ways heat leaves you. First is conduction. Touch a cold log with your bare back, and you feel it instantly. That log is a sponge for heat, pulling energy out of you molecule by molecule, the way a wet wool coat pulls warmth off your shoulders. Second is convection, moving air, that sneaky draft across the floor that makes your ankles ache, even when the thermometer on the wall claims the room is warm. Third is radiation, your body glowing infrared toward anything colder than you are, like a black window that feels like an open door to deep space. Standard frontier builders thought in terms of one enemy, wind. Stop the wind, add more fire, call it good. They packed moss in the cracks, nailed up an extra board wall if they were fancy, and then spent the rest of the winter shoving more logs into an iron stove that glowed cherry red and still left cold shadows in the corners. The walls and floor themselves were heat thieves, but no one talked about that. They just blamed the weather. Jacob watched all 3 enemies at once, even if he never said conduction, convection, radiation in his German accent. He knew a single log wall, no matter how well chinked, let the cold drink from it. So he built stone into the problem. Thick stone on a deep foundation, so the core of the cabin could soak up fire heat slowly instead of letting it bleed straight through to the night. He knew drafts were more than a little breeze. He'd felt that crawling cold along the floorboards in neighbors' cabins, the invisible river of air that stole heat faster than any leaky roof. So he created double walls, and between them, a controlled gap. Not a random whistling crack. A deliberate channel where air could move gently against warm stone, smoothing out those violent convective currents that stripped heat from bare logs. And radiation, those same heavy inner surfaces, once warmed, glowed back at him. Not visibly, but in the way your face feels standing near a sunlit rock in winter. The cabin's core became a quiet campfire in every direction, reducing that one-way radiant drain toward cold windows and outer walls. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, piling on more blankets and more firewood, kept missing? He was quietly attacking all three escape routes at once. Conduction slowed by mass. Convection tamed by layers and gaps. Radiation turned from enemy into ally. Before we reveal the exact technique hiding inside that strange cavity, remember this. The gap every neighbor mocked as a waste of good logs would become Jacob's sharpest weapon against both conduction and convection. The real twist is how that wrong-looking space, once filled and sealed in his peculiar way, stopped acting like empty air at all. Stopped acting like empty air at all. Now, let's see what Jacob built when he finally laid that first real wall. Every neighbor expected the same thing. Logs, fast, familiar, good enough. Drop trees, notch, stack, chink, done before the worst of the winter. Instead, Jacob walked past perfectly good timber and started hauling granite out of the creek bed and weathered sandstone from a low cut on the southern slope. To them, it looked insane. To him, it was non-negotiable. He had watched too many cabins freeze from the floor up, thin log walls, shallow footings, frost creeping through the ground like a slow wet knife. So before a single log went down, he opened the earth. A trench 4 feet deep, all the way to bedrock where he could find it, or at least to hard, undisturbed soil. In a world of 6-inch skids and guesswork, that trench alone marked him as the crazy German. On that, he laid wide stone footings, flat granite, and big sandstone slabs, locked together so their weight spread out like a snowshoe. Those first courses rose well above the height of splash and spring melt, high enough that drifting snow and muddy thaw water would never lick the bottom log. Wood would stay out of the rot zone. The stone would take the abuse. Why stone, when logs were everywhere and free? What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors did not? He understood thermal mass even if he never used the phrase. He had sat in a root cellars dug back into the hill, candles barely flickering, air cool but steady when outside, swung from blazing sun to hard frost. He had slept in thick stone barns in Bavaria where a small, slow fire and animal heat held the night at bay. Those places did not feel warm in the way a roaring stove does. They felt constant, stable, the difference between survival and catastrophe in a long, cold snap. Dense materials like granite and sandstone do something light log walls cannot. They absorb heat slowly during the day. From the stove, from low winter sun slanting through a south window, and then when the fire dies and the sky clears to black, they bleed that heat back out just as slowly. No sudden crash in temperature, no midnight scramble to throw on another log. Stone is different. It does not insulate in the fluffy fiberglass sense. It moderates. It smooths out the wild swings. If you have ever walked into a thick masonry church on a hot afternoon and felt it surprisingly cool, or into an old brick house in January that somehow feels warmer than the thermostat reading, you have met this effect. Modern earthships in New Mexico, thick adobe, and rammed earth houses in the Rockies. They all lean on the same principle Jacob was chasing in the Montana mountains. Huge interior mass, less conventional insulation than the code books like. Yet the rooms ride out heat and cold with fewer spikes. Before we reveal the exact technique hiding inside his double wall, you need to see that first choice. Stone down low, logs up high, mass where the ground tries to steal your heat, wood where you only have to fight the wind. His neighbors laughed when they saw him stacking granite instead of racing to raise log walls. They stopped laughing when their shallow foundations heaved and cracked, and his cabin, sitting on that buried spine of stone, stayed straight, dry, and unnervingly warm. The foundation was not decoration. It was the anchor for the thermal battery he was about to build on top of it. Now he did something that, to his neighbors, crossed the line from careful to crazy. Jacob raised the outer log wall first. Heavy pine, tight notches, deep chinking. From a distance, it looked like any serious Montana cabin going up before winter. But then, instead of moving inside to lay a floor and call it good, he stepped back to the foundation and started again. A second wall, inside the first. He snapped a chalk line 18 inches in from the outer logs and followed it around the entire perimeter. Every corner, every run, the same measured gap. He drilled through the sill logs, pinned guide pegs into the stone foundation, and began stacking a second ring of logs that never quite touched the first. 18 inches of nothing. The Bridger Mountains wind carried the commentary. Reinhardt's lost it. He's building a castle so he can freeze in style. One neighbor stood in the snow, squinting at the growing double ring of timber, and muttered, "That's good wood. Wasted. All that space in between? It'll sweat. Rot from the inside out." You can almost hear the snort. Who needs a hollow cabin wall in a Montana winter? But Jacob had been watching the mountains longer than they had been watching him. He'd hauled potatoes into root cellars, where the air felt cool in summer and almost warm in January, not because of fancy insulation, but because the air barely moved. He'd slept in hay barns where, between stacked bales, that still pocket of air dulled the night's bite. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the standard cabin plans did not? He was not trying to build a modern insulated cavity. No fiberglass bats. No plastic vapor barrier. Instead, he was carving out a controlled, partially baffled airspace, a ring of slowed-down air whose only job was to resist how quickly heat could flee his living space. Conduction through two separated log shells. Convection tamed into slow, gentle loops instead of roaring drafts. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to tame that gap, you need to see how deliberate it was. He kept the 18 inches consistent, so the air would behave predictably, not break into wild convective currents. He tied the two walls together at intervals with short cross members, not to fill the space, but to keep it from ballooning or collapsing. Gaps were chosen, not accidental. Now, let's see what Jacob built from the outside. The cabin did not look like a homestead shack. It looked wrong. The walls were absurdly thick. Log faces staggered like a small frontier fort planted on a spine of stone. Window openings sat deep, almost tunneled. From a distance, it resembled a blockhouse waiting for a siege, not a family home waiting for winter. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century was hiding in that wasted band of air. The question was simple. When the first real blizzard came off the peaks, would that empty space turn into an icebox? Or the quiet buffer that meant the difference between survival and catastrophe? Jacob decided that gap would not stay empty for long. Now, let's see what Jacob built. He started at the floor, where the cold was most relentless. Granite from the river, dark and heavy, went in first. Each block chosen by hand, not for looks, but for weight. Dense stone near the floor meant every degree of heat that reached it could be banked like money in a vault. Higher up, toward shoulder height, he shifted to softer sandstone from the southern ridge. Lighter, a bit more forgiving. Better. For slow, even release. This wasn't random rock tossing. This was geometry with calloused hands. He laid the first courses like a mason without mortar, turning each stone until it locked against its neighbors. Wide faces pressed together, points and ridges knocked off with a hammer so they nested rather than teetered. He was building a continuous band of thermal mass, 18 inches thick, running unbroken around the cabin from corner to corner. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? That contact is everything. Stone touching stone moves warmth far better than stone separated by big, lazy pockets of air. So he hunted down flat surfaces, rotated odd shapes, and refused to leave cavernous voids. From above, that gap began to look less like rubble and more like a stone honeycomb, cells interlocked, ready to drink in energy. But here's the twist. He didn't fill it solid. Jacob left narrow vertical slits, hand-width channels that snaked from the base of the wall up toward the rafters. Not gaping chimneys, but careful pathways. Between clusters of rock, he preserved small pockets where air could linger, warm, and move without turning into a roaring draft. His skeptical neighbors watched him pull stones back out to reopen a finger-wide gap and just shook their heads. Who, in a Montana winter, leaves deliberate spaces in a wall? Before we reveal the exact technique he used to charge those walls, you need the idea he was chasing. He wasn't building insulation. He was building a battery, a thermal battery. By day, the iron stove and low winter sun hammered that inner log face with heat. The logs passed it into the stone band, slowly, relentlessly. Granite and sandstone absorbed the surplus, their mass smoothing out the violent swings between fire blazing and fire dying. Hours after the last log fell to embers, those same stones bled warmth back through the inner wall, keeping the cabin in the mountains strangely, almost suspiciously warm. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century hid in that hybrid. Heavy mass intertwined with controlled airspace, almost the opposite of modern fluffy insulation. The real test would come when the first 20-degree night hit and the neighbors' proper cabins went cold. Would Jacob's quiet stone battery really hold the line, or had he just built the heaviest failure in Montana territory? The first thing a visitor noticed about frontier cabins wasn't the stove. It was the windows, or the lack of them. In 1876, under those Montana mountains, glass was expensive, heat was precious, and fear was a design principle. You cut as few holes in your log wall as you could get away with. Standard practice was blunt. You stacked your logs, then you carved openings wherever the log courses happened to line up without splitting. A slit near the table, a tiny square by the bunk. No one was standing there in the snow with a compass. Thinking about where the sun would travel in winter. South, north, east, west. It was all just outside, and outside meant cold. Those little panes did double duty. You watched for strangers and you tried not to bleed heat. A big window was a liability, a weak point if arrows flew, and a guaranteed cold spot once the wind started probing for gaps. This was normal. This was frontier life. Jacob looked at those same mountains, the same brutal winter sun, and saw a different equation. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors didn't? That every hole in a wall isn't equal. Some leak, some pay you back. Now, let's see what Jacob built. On his north wall, the side that never saw the sun in December, he cut almost nothing. Just 2 narrow slots, more like rifle ports than windows, high and tight under the eaves. On the west, where the afternoon wind knifed down the draw, he kept the glass even smaller. Thin, vertical slits, enough to read the weather, not enough to bleed his hard-won heat. Then you walk around to the south side. Different world. For a cabin of that era, Jacob's south wall looked almost extravagant. 3 windows, each larger than anything on the other sides, stacked where the low winter sun would rake across the room. Still modest by modern standards, but deliberate in a way his neighbors' random openings were not. Here's the quiet physics he was playing with. In winter, the sun rides low in the southern sky. Its rays don't come straight down. They come in shallow, like a hand reaching under a blanket. Those rays punch through glass, hit dark floors and the heavy stone hidden in his double wall, and load them with heat. The surface is warm, then slowly re-radiate that warmth back into the room long after the sun slips behind the ridge. Pattern interrupt. His cabin was darker, on purpose. Fewer total windows. Long shadowed corners. But where light did enter, it mattered. It hit stone, not empty air. It turned that mixed mass of log and rock into a daytime heat sponge, charging the battery the fire would draw down at night. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to tune that balance, remember this. On a clear day, that south glass could add several degrees of free heat even when it was 10 below outside. Modern passive solar cabins quietly copy the same move. South-facing glass, dark floors, interior masonry walls that drink in sun and bleed it back after dark. It's the same knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Use the sky as a second stove. In the next part, we'll see how Jacob combined that free solar gain with his stone-filled walls and a strangely modest fire to hold a line between comfort and the difference between survival and catastrophe. But glass and winter sun were only half the trick. Inside that cabin, Jacob did something even stranger with the fire itself. Now, let's see what Jacob built. He did not shove his iron stove against an outside wall like his neighbors, bleeding heat straight into the cold. He planted it almost dead center in the room, lifted on a low stone plinth, and tied that plinth directly into the inner stone wall. Not loose bricks, not a token hearth, a welded-together island of mass that touched the cabin's thermal core. When that stove roared on a January night, it wasn't just heating air. It was charging stone. Look at where he put the weight. The densest, heaviest stone in the entire wall system ran from the floor up to about 7 feet, below the rafters, below the loft peak, right in the zone where human bodies actually live, where you sit at the table, stand to cook, lean back on a bunk, or stretch out to sleep. His neighbors stacked stone where it was convenient, random, low, or just around the stove. Jacob stacked it where flesh could feel it. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the catalog plans did not? He understood that comfort is not a thermostat number. It's what your skin sees. Cold walls at shoulder height radiate like open doors to the void. Warm walls at that same height quietly push heat back at you. By concentrating mass from floor to 7 feet, Jacob created a kind of radiant band around the room. Those stone-filled walls, slow to heat but even slower to cool, would sit a few degrees warmer than the air once the fire had been running for days. You could stand 3 feet away, feel no draft at all, and yet sense that gentle, invisible wash of warmth on your face and hands. Instead of your body donating heat to icy log surfaces, the balance flipped. The walls paid you. He didn't ignore the floor either. Most frontier cabins sat on stones with bare dirt inside, maybe a thin scattering of boards that turned into ice-cold radiators for the ground. Jacob laid thicker plank flooring over a shallow, insulated crawl space with selected stone in contact with earth, but buffered by packed fill and air. Enough connection to keep the underfloor from swinging wildly, but not so much that the cold of the mountains could surge straight up into his boots. Modern building science has a name for what he built: radiant comfort. Warm surfaces at body level, cooler air, and very little breeze. Turn the air to 72 degrees Celsius with cold walls and you still feel chilled. Let the air sit at 64 degrees with walls and floors in the same range and your body relaxes. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to balance that radiant band with fresh air, without freezing the cabin, you need to see how he controlled the one thing every frontier family feared most: the night the fire went out. Jacob's answer to the night the fire went out was to let the outside in, not wide open, not a draft whistling through your blankets, thin, deliberate cuts in the armor of his cabin, placed where no sane homesteader in the mountains of Montana would have allowed daylight. If you crouch by a stove on a clear afternoon and let your eyes adjust, you could see it, a hairline glow at the base of the wall just behind the iron firebox, another faint line high on the outer log wall, tucked beneath a roof beam, slits no wider than a knife blade, where the winter sun traced silver threads straight through his defenses. Neighbors noticed. Of course they did. They had spent half their first winter ramming moss and mud into every crack they could find, then tacking rags over the worst offenders. To them, a gap you could see daylight through was an insult to common sense. One even joked that Jacob had built a flute, not a cabin, but Jacob had 20 years of smoky cabins and pounding headaches behind him. He'd watched fires struggle for air, stealing oxygen from the room, dragging icy drafts across the floor toward the flames. He'd seen children sleeping on tick mattresses, wake with red eyes and raw throats because the only ventilation was smoke leaking out wherever it could. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors did not? He believed a fire should have its own path to breathe, a dedicated vein of air from outside to flame so it didn't have to suck life out of the room and pull the cold in at ankle level. Now, let's see what Jacob built. Low on the wall, just inches from the stove, he bored small inlets through the outer logs and into the cavity between his double walls. Those openings fed into a narrow wooden chase that rose slightly, then dropped right beside the stove's intake. Cold air slipped in, hugged the floor for only a moment, then was grabbed by the heat rising off the iron and swept into the fire. Higher up, near the top of the outer wall, he carved those knife-slit outlets. Warm, slightly moist air from the wall cavity, and the top of the room eased out there, not in a roaring wind, but in a slow exhale. Together, the low inlets and high outlets formed a quiet vertical convective loop, cold air in, low, heated, rising, then drifting out high, carrying smoke traces and moisture with it. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to tune that loop for different winds and temperatures, you need to see how wrong his neighbors had it. They stuffed every crack they could find. Then they sat in cabins that still leaked, only now the leaks were invisible, sneaking under doors and between floorboards, slashing across bare ankles. Fires starved for air and back-puffed smoke. Condensation bloomed on cold single walls, dripping behind beds and freezing in corners. Jacob's walls, by contrast, stayed dry. The stone core stayed warm. The air felt fresh without feeling fierce. This was knowledge that's been buried for over a century, that a perfectly sealed winter cabin can feel clammy and cold, while one with tiny strategic leaks can feel gently alive. And on the coldest, stillest nights of that brutal winter, no wind, no natural ventilation at all, those wrong gaps would decide the difference between survival and catastrophe. Those wrong gaps would decide the difference between survival and catastrophe. And that's exactly when the expert showed up. Late August, with the first bite of mountain cold already in the morning air, 3 men rode up the draw toward Jacob's half-finished cabin. Not gossipy neighbors, not curious passers-by. These were the men other settlers asked when they wanted a cabin to stay standing through a Montana winter. At the front of the trio sat Samuel Creek. Creek wasn't just a loud opinion at the trading post. He had overseen the building of 27 cabins across Montana and Wyoming, from the Gallatin Valley to the Wind River country. He knew every trick with a log, every way a wall could twist, rot, or collapse. If a roof line in those mountains looked straight, odds were good Samuel Creek had sighted it in. Behind him rode William Thorpe, former Army engineer turned surveyor, the man with the measuring chains and the habit of counting everything. And beside them, Thomas Brickner, the merchant who sold tools, nails, hinges, and saw blades to half the homesteaders in 3 counties. Together, they were the gospel of tradition on horseback. They reined up and stared. 2 log walls, 18 inches apart, running around the footprint of the cabin. Between them, Jacob had already stacked a waist-high ribbon of stone, river-rounded granite, and blocky sandstone rising out of a deep foundation. To Creek, it looked less like a home and more like a mistake you could break an ankle on. Creek spat, squinted, and broke the silence. Book learning, he muttered. Man reads one pamphlet from back east and forgets the way cabins are built. Brickner chuckled. If he'd read a book, Samuel, he'd know you don't trap moisture between two walls. This here is fool learning. Costs twice the timber, buys half the sense. Thorpe swung down, ran a hand over the inner wall, then rapped his knuckles on the stone-filled gap. You pack this tight, Reinhardt, he called. You'll hold every drop of water the winter gives you. No place for it to dry. You'll get rot in both walls, frost in the gap, and she'll heave herself apart by the second thaw. To them, it was obvious. Trapped moisture in that stone-filled cavity. Wasted logs on a double wall when a single thick wall had worked for generations. Extra labor for no added R value, as they understood it. Just a heavier way to lose heat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that 3 seasoned frontiersmen and an army engineer were missing? Jacob didn't argue. He didn't pull out numbers or talk about barns with stone cellars that stayed cool in summer and strangely warm in winter. He didn't mention the old Scandinavian stories he'd heard as a boy about farmhouses with mass-heavy walls that held the day's fire deep into the night. He just lifted another stone, set it into the gap, tapped it so it kissed its neighbors on 3 faces, minimizing air between them, turning that empty space into a single, slow-breathing core. Before we reveal the exact technique hiding inside those walls, understand this. The social pressure to conform was enormous. In a place where a bad cabin meant frostbite, pneumonia, or worse, defying Samuel Creek's methods was almost a moral crime. Creek shook his head, already certain of the ending. Come first real winter, he said, loud enough for Jacob and the watching neighbors to hear. We'll see that pretty wall sag. You can't cheat cold in these mountains. Now, let's see what Jacob built that winter that made every one of those predictions age like wet timber in a January freeze. The mockery started before the outer wall was even closed. At the trading post, with the Bridger Mountains already dusted white, men leaned on flour barrels and watched Jacob haul yet another sled of stone past the window. One of them snorted. Reinhardt's building a fort for the Sioux, he said, loud enough to carry. Laughter cracked through the room like splitting kindling. In a territory where every cabin was thin and fast, his thick, heavy project looked like overkill, or madness. This was normal. This was frontier life. But the ridicule had teeth. Samuel Creek, who'd already declared Jacob's foundation too fussy, lifted his tin cup and shook his head. It's a waste of good timber, he told the room. You stack logs once, you're done. He's stacking them twice, then burying them in rock. All that work to trap cold. To men who measured value in cords cut and miles ridden, doubling a wall for invisible heat sounded like superstition. Outside, near the hitching rail, Thorpe spat into the frozen mud as Jacob passed. He eyed the rising double wall, the narrow windows, the stone creeping higher between. Building a castle to freeze in, he muttered. Mark it. First hard winter, that thing'll sweat, then ice from the inside. You can almost hear the certainty, can't you? What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the experts of the settlement were so sure he'd missed? The women had their own verdict. On wash days with steam rising from iron kettles, they talked while hands worked. He's making a dark cave for that poor wife, one said, picturing the low windows and thick walls. No light, no air. Children'll be pale as candles. In a world where sunlight felt like medicine, Jacob's cabin looked like a prescription for gloom. Brickner, who fancied himself a practical man, turned the gossip into policy. At a Sunday gathering, he spoke low but clear. Don't copy such foolishness, he warned the younger men. You build walls like that, you'll trap damp, rot your logs, and freeze twice as hard. Frontier's harsh enough without cleverness. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century often looks like arrogance the first time it resurfaces. The social cost followed fast. When other cabins went up, offers of shared labor flowed. 2, 3, 6 men trading days like currency. At Jacob's site, the help thinned. An afternoon here, an hour there, then excuses. Hunting trips were planned without him. Talk of shared woodlots, of pooling effort for winter fuel, happened in corners where he wasn't standing. He noticed. He just didn't bend. Jacob worked later than the rest, lantern light flickering against log and stone. He rechecked each placement, listening with his hands more than his ears, adjusting a rock so it pressed tighter against its neighbors, closing unseen gaps where heat might bleed away. Sometimes he'd pause, glove off, running his fingers slowly along the inner wall, as if feeling a future fire already stored there. Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to see this. He was building for a different winter than the one his neighbors imagined. By the time the first snowflakes drifted down, soft and slow, over the valley, Jacob's cabin stood finished, but strange, thick, low-windowed, heavy, as if it were bracing itself against something pressing in from the mountains that no one else quite believed in yet. Now, let's see what Jacob built when that something finally arrived, and why those same men would soon fight for a place near his door. From the road, Jacob's cabin looked wrong before you even knew why. Your eye just stopped on it. In a valley of tall, skinny rectangles, his place sat there like it had sunk its heels into the earth and refused to move. The walls were the first insult to frontier common sense. Where his neighbors stacked a single log thickness, 10, maybe 12 inches, Jacob had built a double line of timber nearly twice as thick in profile. 2 log walls, 18 inches apart, rising together. Between them, hidden from casual view, 8,000 pounds of stone. From outside, it read as one massive band of wood, deeper in shadow, heavier in silhouette, like the cabin was wearing armor. Then the windows, or rather the lack of them. Where other cabins opened big panes toward the valley, chasing every scrap of pale winter light, Jacob punched in small square openings that looked almost offensive. Fewer windows, shorter sills, deep reveals that turned glass into dark eyes under a heavy brow. From inside, that meant something you felt instantly. Less daylight, fewer sweeping views of the frozen creek and the white mountains beyond. Step over the threshold and the trade-offs sharpened. The interior was darker by a good margin, the kind of dim where the fire did as much lighting as heating. Those double walls' 8-floor area, 18 inches of inner wall footprint all the way around, stole usable space from a cabin that was already modest. A neighbor joked that Jacob had built a house for his stone and then squeezed himself into the leftover. But that heavy look demanded heavy bones. To carry that mass, Jacob dug 4 feet down, cutting through frost and clay until his shovel rang on bedrock. He laid a broad stone foundation, wider than any other cabin in the valley, then braced the log shell with extra diagonal members so the walls wouldn't bow under the weight of the rock infill. While his neighbors felled trees and called it good, he spent week after week hauling stone from the river and the ridges, sledging it up the slope when the first skims of ice formed. Now, let's see what Jacob built in the eyes of the town. To them, this wasn't ingenuity. It was a warning sign. Old-timers pointed it out to newcomers with a shake of the head. This is what happens when you ignore what works on the frontier. Too thick, too dark, too much stone. He's building a root cellar with windows, one rancher said, not a cabin for a Montana winter. Pattern interrupt. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? Because that visual wrongness, the squat profile, the tiny windows, the overbuilt foundation, burned itself into everyone's memory. When the real cold came down out of the mountains and the difference between survival and catastrophe stopped being theoretical, nobody would be able to say they'd forgotten Jacob's absurd-looking cabin. It was the one building in the valley you simply could not unsee. Before we reveal the exact technique that turned those thick, stone-filled walls into a silent heat battery, you need to remember how ridiculous it looked to them. That contrast is the whole point. It's the hinge where this story swings from mockery to knowledge that's been buried for over a century, and the moment when every man who laughed would find himself drifting toward that low, dark doorway, drawn by something they hadn't planned on believing: warm air. By the time their laughter faded from Jacob's doorway, the first real warning had already settled on the valley. Ice. Not the thin, glassy skin they were used to skimming with a boot heel in late November, but a thick, milky pain on the river that swallowed thrown stones with a dull, heavy thud. When ice sounds like wood, old men in the mountains start paying attention. Geese that usually lingered into December were gone by the second week of the month. The sky felt empty. Trapper Bill Hanrahan, who'd survived 3 decades of Montana winters and had the frostbitten ears to prove it, squinted at the ridge one gray morning and muttered, "Hard one's coming. Hardest since 36, marks me." He wasn't far off. Territorial records from Fort Benton would later log the winter of 1876-77 as the coldest in nearly 40 years. Repeated cold snaps, nighttime lows near 20 below, wind chills driving it far past what exposed skin could tolerate, weeks where the thermometer never clawed its way above 0. This wasn't a cold spell. This was a siege. The settlement responded the only way it knew how, with axes, mud, and desperation. Men who had spent summer laughing at Jacob's double wall now raced the short daylight, felling green lodgepole, splitting it into cordwood piles that never seemed high enough. Every cabin became a project site. Extra chinking jammed into gaps with numb fingers, moss, mud, even old wool rags stuffed between shrinking logs. Windows, already small, shrank again under makeshift shutters. Rough boards, hinged with strips of leather, gunny sacks nailed over the worst drafts. Inside, beds crept closer to the single iron stoves and open fireplaces until whole families were sleeping in tight semicircles around the one reliable source of heat. You can picture it. Boots lying like soldiers around the hearth, blankets hung as interior walls to trap a few more degrees. And in the middle of this, Jacob's cabin didn't stand out. Not yet. It was just another low, dark rectangle under the white weight of early snow, smoke rising from its chimney like every other place. The double log wall filled with stone was, to most neighbors, still a curiosity, an oddity built by a stubborn mountain man who read too many German books. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to see how perfect this winter was as a brutal, uncontrolled experiment. Same valley, same wind screaming down the same draws, nearly identical cabins, with one exception. Because for some families, the coming months would mean blackened toes and fingers, cattle dead in snow-choked draws, grain bins scraped to bare wood. For others, it would be merely brutal, a season endured instead of survived. That difference between survival and catastrophe would play out behind log walls, one stone at a time. And as the temperature fell and the woodpile shrank, the quiet benchmark of comfort on that frozen flat wouldn't be the biggest cabin or the one with the fanciest stove. It would be the one every man had mocked, the one they'd soon visit at night just to feel what warm air actually meant. The first real test didn't wait long. 2 weeks after Jacob finished chinking the last gap in his strange double wall, the first blizzard came down off the Bridger Mountains like a living thing. Wind-driven snow came in horizontal, not falling but flying, clawing at every crack in every cabin. Smoke from the chimneys didn't rise. It was whipped flat, torn sideways into the dark. By 9 o'clock, the temperature outside had plunged past 0. The wind chill pushed it toward 40 below. You could hear the roofs groan. Standard Montana winter. This was normal. This was frontier life. Inside the Petersons' cabin, the iron stove roared cherry red. The air right beside it held at about 65 degrees, faces flushed, backs cold. 2 quilts hung behind their bed to block the draft that never really stopped. They had burned through half a day's wood just to keep the room comfortable. By midnight, they were done. Eyes gritty, arms aching from hauling, they let the last load of split pine burn down. Coals glowed, flames died. They banked the door, pulled the quilts tighter, and fell into the kind of exhausted sleep only people who wrestle real cold understand. 2 hours later, the storm was worse. Wind screamed around the corners, probing for weakness. Inside that single-wall cabin, physics did what it always does. Heat rushed to cold. The logs bled their warmth straight into the night. At 2 a.m., Mrs. Peterson woke to a sound every frontier parent knew too well. Thin, panicked crying. The children were shivering hard enough to rattle the bed frame. Their breath smoked in the air. When she crossed the floor, the boards burned her feet with cold. She checked the enamel water bucket beside the stove. A skin of ice had locked across the top. In 2 hours, the air near the stove had fallen from 65 to barely above freezing. The far corners were worse. Frost traced the gaps in the wall. Now, cut across the frozen flat to Jacob's cabin. His fire had been allowed to sink low as well. Only a faint orange lay in the belly of the stove. But when he swung his legs out of bed at that same hour, the air didn't bite. It felt normal. Cool, but gentle. The kind of cool you notice, not fear. A simple thermometer on a peg told the story. Earlier that evening, his family had eaten supper at 68 degrees. Now, after 2 hours with almost no flame, the room sat near 60. 8 degrees lost, not 30, not 40. Here's where it gets strange. Jacob put his palm flat against the interior log wall. It felt faintly warm, as if something inside the cabin itself were quietly working. His wife noticed it first. Standing there in the half-dark, she whispered that the walls felt like they were breathing out heat, exhaling against the cold that pressed from the mountains outside. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that his neighbors did not? Before we reveal the exact technique, remember, to them this wasn't theory. This was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Because by dawn, men from those freezing cabins would step into Jacob's and stop short, stunned by air that still felt warm, and the secret wasn't the stove. Now, let's see what Jacob built inside those walls that made a blizzard feel like a test he'd already passed. But warm air and surprised faces are still, to a man like Samuel Creek, just stories. He wants numbers. So a week later, he comes back to Jacob's cabin, not with insults, but with a plan. Same brass thermometer, same winter, different attitude. He proposes an experiment the way only a freezing man can. Dawn readings, 3 cabins, no excuses. His, Jacob's, and a third neighbor who swore his good American walls were all anyone needed in these mountains. Late December, sky the color of old iron. Night low was 10 below zero. Real Montana winter. Samuel steps outside first, breath hanging in the air, fingers already numb as he squints at the little column of red. -10 Fahrenheit, steady. That's the baseline. That's the enemy. He walks into his own cabin first. Fire burned down hours ago. He pushes the thermometer into the far corner, away from the stove, at chest height. 36 degrees, on paper, above freezing. In reality, you can see his breath. Then he kneels, holds the bulb a foot off the plank floor. 30. The floor feels like a block of ice through his boots. His children never sit there. They perch on the bed to stay warm. Next, the proud neighbor's place. Single log wall, tight chinking, everything done proper. Chest height in the far corner. 41. Better. Floor level. 32. The air up where a man stands feels almost warm, but the floor still bites. Heat piled under the rafters, cold pooled at their feet. This was normal. This was frontier life. Then Jacob's cabin. Samuel braces for something. He steps in and feels it before he measures it. No shock of cold, no rush to the stove, just a calm, even warmth that doesn't match the brutal morning outside. Chest height, far corner, no fire burning since midnight. 68 degrees. He checks twice, taps the glass. The red line doesn't care about his doubts. Floor level, a child's reach above the plank, 60. In a Montana dawn at 10 below, the worst place in Jacob's cabin is still warmer than the best place in his own. And here's the detail that really twists the knife. Jacob's children are on the floor, sitting, playing with carved wooden animals on a braided rug, bare hands on the planks, feet wrapped in thin wool. No stamping, no complaints. While in other cabins, parents warn kids away from the floor like it's another piece of the winter trying to kill them. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? Samuel steps back outside and looks at the wood piles. His own stack has slumped visibly in a week, edges ragged from frantic cutting. The proud neighbor's pile is worse, nearly halved, bark and chips scattered like sawdust snow. Jacob's, neat, square, edges still crisp. Maybe a third gone where theirs are nearly chewed through. These aren't tall tales around a stove. These are measurements. Thermometers, not pride. Woodpiles, not opinions. Quietly, grudgingly, the settlement starts to admit that Jacob's wrong double wall of stone and logs is doing something their right cabins are not. Before we reveal the exact technique, remember this. In a winter like that, a 10-degree edge isn't comfort. It's the difference between survival and catastrophe. And Jacob wasn't winning by 10. He was winning by 30. Now let's see what Jacob built that turned numbers on a brass thermometer into knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Now let's see what Jacob built when the thermometer said one thing, and the air on your skin said something very different. His neighbors had single log walls, 8 to 10 inches thick, one layer between them and the Montana winter. Heat rushed through by conduction, hot interior surface, cold exterior surface, temperature difference driving energy straight out into the snow. The logs warmed quickly, cooled quickly, and every gust of wind just pulled more heat through that thin barrier. Jacob's cabin did something else. He turned his walls into a slow, heavy heat reservoir. Dense stone in the middle, air wrapped around it, logs only on the outside. In physics terms, he stretched time. Instead of letting heat sprint through a narrow wall, he forced it to crawl through a thick, heavy, reluctant pathway. Stone is dense. Those 8,000 pounds of riverstone and sandstone pressed into that 18-inch cavity didn't just block heat, they stored it. When the stove ran all afternoon, the inner log face and the exposed stone at the floor edge absorbed energy. That energy soaked into the wall, warming each layer of stone a few degrees at a time. High density meant a huge number of molecules to excite. High heat capacity per cubic foot meant each degree of temperature rise represented a lot of stored energy. Then, when the fire died, conduction reversed direction. But instead of the room crashing from 60 C8 degrees to nearly freezing in a few hours like his neighbors' cabins, the stone bled its heat back inward, slowly, predictably. That's why Jacob saw mid-50s by dawn, while other cabins woke up to 36 degree air and ice in the wash basin. But conduction is only one villain. Inside a typical stud or log wall with a big open cavity, warm air next to the inner surface rises, cold air falls, and you get a convective loop quietly stripping heat off that inner wall. It's like having a tiny invisible fan running all night inside your own structure. Jacob's partially filled gap broke that loop. Stones, irregular and tightly packed, left no tall, open channels for air to race through. Any air that did move had to snake around corners, rubbing against stone, losing energy. The result was sluggish, damped convection. Less internal air motion meant the inner log surface held its warmth longer. And then there's radiation, the form of heat your skin feels even when the air is cool. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, staring at their glowing stoves, completely missed? Warm interior surfaces matter more than a hot metal box in the corner. Inside Jacob's cabin, the inner log wall, the thick plank floor, and the stone stove plinth all ran a few degrees warmer than the air. Those surfaces radiated infrared energy directly to his body. You could sit with the air at 60 degrees, but feel as if it were several degrees warmer because every surface saw you and quietly beamed heat toward you. In the neighbors' cabins, thin, cold walls radiated the other way, stealing warmth from faces and hands even with a roaring fire. So was Jacob's cabin always hotter? Not necessarily. It was more stable. Fewer brutal peaks when the fire roared, fewer crashes when it burned out. The energy curve flattened. That stability meant his family could let the stove go dark for 6, even 8 hours and still wake up comfortable. Here's the key insight, the piece of knowledge that's been buried for over a century. By turning his walls into thermal mass, Jacob turned every stick of firewood into a longer, smoother heat release. Same fuel, different timeline. His neighbors burned 2.4 cords a week to chase the cold. Jacob burned about half that and made the cold chase him. And the strangest part? The physics that saved his cabin in 1876 is the same physics hiding inside modern passive solar homes today. In the next section, we'll see how those mountains, that stone, and one uneducated immigrant quietly predicted 21st century energy design. February is when the mountains stop pretending to be friendly. By the second week, the cold is not an event. It's a condition. The tall, proud wood piles that had stood like little forts behind every cabin in December? By February, they're stumps. Ragged, waist-high reminders of optimism. Men who had laughed at Jacob in October now tramp through knee-deep snow, hauling green, wet logs from the creek bottoms, steam rising off their shoulders, not because it's warm, but because they're desperate. Green wood hisses in their stoves. It spits, smokes, and coats the flues in creosote. It gives off more frustration than heat. You can picture it. A woman cracking open the stove door, seeing the dull, lazy flames, and doing the arithmetic in her head. One more armload tonight means one less in March. Frontier budgeting wasn't about dollars, it was about BTUs. So the rationing begins. Fires lit late, banked early. Some families choose cook or warm. If you've never felt that calculation, imagine deciding whether to boil beans or keep your children's feet from going numb. Long hours are spent under quilts, not from laziness, but strategy. People stay in bed because the bed is the only place in the cabin that remembers what warm feels like. Neighbors sleep in layers of wool and fur, hats on, scarves wrapped, breath freezing in little crystals along mustaches. Someone rolls over at 3 a.m. and a sleeve brushes the log wall. Instant flinch. The wall feels like touching the inside of an icebox. This was normal. This was winter. Except not in Jacob's cabin. Now let's see what Jacob built looks like under February pressure. His fire still burns dry, seasoned wood, not piled in a panic, but fed in a steady, modest rhythm. He has enough reserve that he can be picky. Denser splits for the coldest nights, lighter cuts when the sun has already charged the stone. While his neighbors count sticks, Jacob is quietly managing a fuel portfolio. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? That when you load 8,000 pounds of stone into a double wall and keep it gently heated day after day, you aren't just burning wood. You're charging a thermal battery. In February, that difference between survival and catastrophe finally shows up as lifestyle, not theory. Evenings in Jacob's cabin look wrong for the Montana Territory. His wife mends by lamplight in her shirt sleeves. The children read and play on the floor, not huddled under blankets, but moving freely around the room. The air isn't scorching near the stove and freezing by the walls. It's just evenly warm. The stone has flattened the violence of the cold. Outside, the wind chews at the corners of the other cabins. Inside them, people hover within arm's reach of the fire. In Jacob's, someone can stand by the outer wall, place a hand near the log, and feel not the bite of outside, but the slow, stored warmth leaking back into the room. One night, a neighbor finally cracks. He stomps through the drift to Jacob's door, face stiff, eyelashes frozen into white combs. The door swings open. He steps inside and just stands there. He feels his eyelashes thaw. This isn't a little warmer. This is a different category of winter entirely. And the question that will haunt the valley is simple. If his cabin can feel like this in February, what else about heat and walls have they been getting wrong? He doesn't move at first. That alone tells you everything. In a normal Montana cabin, you dive for the stove, you peel off mittens with your teeth, you do the frantic thawing dance over a plank floor that feels like a block of ice. Here, he just stands there. Boots on warm boards, no sharp draft licking at his ankles, no invisible river of cold air sliding in under the door and knifing across the room. The heat isn't roaring, it's present. Even. From the floor to his shoulders, the air feels the same. When he leans back against Jacob's inner log wall, there's no shock of cold biting through wool. The wall isn't stealing heat from his spine, it's giving some back. Now, let's see what Jacob built in human terms, not just numbers. In his cabin, every large surface that sees you is near your skin temperature. The stone hidden between those double log walls has been quietly radiating for hours. You're not just warming the air near the ceiling and hoping some drifts down. Your body is trading heat with the room like two friends passing a cup back and forth. Compare that to his neighbors' cabins. Same mountains, same winter, different experience. In those single wall boxes, the air near the ceiling can hit 80 degrees while the floor sulks near 40. Your face sweats, your feet go numb, and every outer corner becomes a little cold trap you avoid without thinking. Families huddle in a tight ring around the stove because 3 steps back, the cold wall starts drinking heat from your chest. This is where comfort stops being thermostat math and becomes embodied reality. Jacob's radiant surfaces and stable temperatures meant you could walk around in shirt sleeves while his neighbors still wore their outer coats indoors. You could sit by the outer wall and read without your back turning into a heat sink. At night, the cabin eased down into the mid-50s, but with the stone still warm and no icy drafts at floor level, people slept deeply instead of waking every 2 hours to feed a frantic fire. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the others missed? He understood that if the walls and floor feel warm, your body relaxes. You cough less. You don't have that raw, cold air pouring over your face all night. Less condensation formed on Jacob's interior logs, which meant less mold, fewer winter lung infections, and none of that clammy, cold at 70 degrees feeling you might know from your own house. Pattern interrupt. This isn't just frontier nostalgia. This is you right now. You've probably been in a modern home where the thermostat reads 70 degrees, but the couch against the exterior wall feels chilly and your feet never quite warm up. Then you visit a smaller, well-designed place set to 66 degrees, and it feels genuinely cozy. That's the same principle Jacob accidentally perfected. Surfaces and air moving in harmony, radiant comfort doing the heavy lifting, and the fire becoming a gentle helper instead of a tyrant you have to serve all night. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to get there, we need to look at how standard cabins were bleeding heat into the winter dark, and why almost everyone in the valley trusted the wrong kind of warmth. The valley would find out the hard way. January 1877, 3rd week of the cold snap. The Bridger Mountains were locked under a sky that looked hammered from iron. Nighttime lows had been brushing 22 degrees for days, when driving the chill past 40. This was the week when good enough cabins started to fail. In the creek cabin, the failure had a sound, a sharp metallic crack from the stovepipe as the iron shrank in the sudden cold, then a hiss of smoke curling from a split in the elbow joint. At first, Samuel Creek did what every frontier father did. He shoved rags in the gap, adjusted the damper, muttered that it would hold. It did not hold. Within an hour, the room was hazy, his youngest coughing, eyes watering. Smoke was now bleeding from every joint in the pipe. The choice was brutal and simple. Keep the fire and risk suffocating the family, or kill the fire and risk the cold. This was the difference between survival and catastrophe, compressed into a single midnight decision. He let the fire die. What happened next showed exactly how little backup a standard cabin really had. With no flame in the box, the heat drained away like someone had pulled a plug. By the second hour, the wash water in the basin had skinned over with ice. By the third, the bucket near the door froze solid, a dull white column under a crust of rime. Bread loaves on the shelf, baked that afternoon, stiffened like bricks. Frost crept across the interior log wall, tracing every gap in the chinking. You could see the pattern of the wind in the crystals. Air that had felt barely tolerable at 40 degrees plunged toward the 20s, while the thermometer outside hovered in the teens below zero. Samuel watched his children huddled under every blanket he owned, breath fogging in front of their faces, inside. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of American frontiersmen had overlooked? That question hadn't mattered when the stove behaved. Now it was the only question that mattered. He made the call. Before dawn, he was hauling quilts and sleeping pallets through thigh-deep snow, each step punching down to the crust. The wind clawed at his coat. His lantern flame guttered. His own cabin, the one he'd bragged about for years, stood behind him like a dark, frozen box. Ahead, Jacob's place glowed faintly. Now, let's see what Jacob built under real pressure. Samuel shouldered into the Reinhardt cabin, expecting a blast of cold. Instead, he got air that felt almost shockingly warm. Not summer, but gentle. Above 60 degrees by the small mercury thermometer on Jacob's shelf, with only a modest fire idling in the stove, no frost on the inner wall, no ice in the water pail by the door. The stones hidden between those double log walls had been quietly charging for days, and now with Jacob's fire banked low, they were still giving heat back. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century was radiating out of 8,000 pounds of riverstone, while Samuel's proper single-wall cabin turned into a walk-in freezer the moment its one mechanical heart stopped. Standing there, boots still crusted with his own interior frost, Samuel Creek finally saw the trap he'd built. Decades of expert building had left his family one cracked stovepipe away from disaster. Jacob's walls, heavy and patient, had bought him something no catalog plan mentioned: time, and a margin of safety when the fire went dark. Samuel's breath still hangs in that frozen cabin air. Cut. LEDs hum. A gas furnace kicks on. We're not in 1876 Montana anymore. We're in a modern mountain subdivision, beige vinyl siding pressed against the same brutal winter Jacob knew, only now there's a 2-car garage and a smart thermostat glowing 72. Now, let's see what Jacob built by walking through your house. In your mind, step out of his log cabin and into your living room. Where does the cold live? The corner behind the couch where nobody sits in January. That hallway that feels like a wind tunnel at night. The guest room that might as well be a walk-in freezer once the sun goes down. You know those places. Your dog knows those places. Pause there for a second. Hand on that outside wall. It's framed with neat studs, fluffy insulation, a plastic vapor barrier, maybe half, an inch of drywall, and some paint. Very modern, very official, but in terms of how it handles heat, it's not that far from a frontier cabin, a thin shell trying to hold back a very large, very patient winter. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that your building inspector never mentioned? He understood that a cabin isn't just about blocking cold. It's about where the heat lives. In most houses, there is almost no mass on the inside, Just air, fabric, and a paper-thin wall surface. The moment the furnace clicks off, the temperature falls fast, just like Samuel's proud, code-approved box. Pattern interrupt. Zoom out from your thermostat to a drone shot over the mountains, shiny new A-frames, tiny houses on trailers, rows of suburban builds. They look different, but thermally, many are the same light, hollow shells. The catalog plans changed, the physics did not, and yet, scattered among them, you can still find cabins that quietly cheat winter using Jacob-like tricks. A double-stud wall, not just wider for more fiberglass, but packed with dense cellulose and lined with interior plywood, so the wall itself carries weight and heat. A masonry heater built right in the middle of the floor plan, its stone mass tied to interior walls, so every firing charges a huge thermal battery. An earth-bermed side of a house, 3 walls pressed into the hill so the ground's steady temperature backs you up when the wind goes feral. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century, resurfacing in building science blogs and backcountry forums instead of in the owner's manual for your furnace. In those heavier, stranger-looking homes, a cloudy day doesn't feel like a crisis. A power outage is an inconvenience, not the difference between survival and catastrophe. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, hold that image of your own floor plan in your mind. You do not have to tear the cabin of your life down to the foundation, but you can steal his best ideas. In the next sections, we'll turn his stone and log experiments into small, surgical changes, places to add mass, redirect heat, and turn your thin-walled box into something that stays warm long after the fire or the furnace goes dark. So here's the twist Jacob would probably yell across the snow at you. Your walls might be lying to you. Modern building gospel says, add more insulation, higher R value, thicker bats. That's the religion. Fiberglass, spray foam, tight plastic vapor barriers, stop the heat from leaking out, and you win the winter. But what did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of builders under fluorescent lights often overlook? Insulation is not heat. It's resistance to heat flow. That pink or yellow blanket in a stud wall is just a speed bump for conduction, the way a good coat slows the cold from biting your skin. Fiberglass, foam, mineral wool, high R value champions. They're light, fluffy, full of trapped air. They slow heat escaping, but they don't store much of it. When the fire dies or the furnace clicks off, there's nothing in those walls that can give warmth back. Thermal mass is different. Mass is storage. Stone, brick, dense wood, packed earth, heavy materials that soak up heat, hold it, then release it slowly over time. Think about your morning coffee. An insulated paper cup keeps your hand from burning, but once the coffee cools, it's cold and dead. A thick ceramic mug? Less insulation, way more mass. It warms your hand. It stays warm long after you've set it down. The mug didn't just block heat, it banked it. Most modern construction maximizes the paper cup and minimizes the mug. Thin drywall, hollow stud bays, oceans of fluffy insulation, almost no real mass. The result? Fast temperature swings, rooms that overheat in a sunblast, then feel cold and clammy an hour after sunset. You're not living in a cabin. You're living inside a padded cooler that constantly begs for active heat. Now, let's see what Jacob built in those mountains. His log walls and tight chinking gave him moderate insulation, sure. But the real trick was the weight. Double log walls with that 18-inch gap filled with stone from floor to 7 feet, a heavy plank floor, thick stove base, dense interior partitions. He turned his cabin into a slow, stubborn thermal battery. The fire charged the stone. The stone smoothed every temperature swing the Montana winter could throw at it. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to move heat into that mass, pause and look around your own place in your mind. Where is the mass hiding? A brick fireplace you've walled off with a mantel and TV? Tile floors that never see direct sun? Interior brick or stone you've covered with paint and furniture? Even heavy timber beams and solid doors are small, forgotten batteries. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Insulation and mass are partners, not rivals. One slows the loss. The other carries you through the night. In the next section, we'll turn that idea into specific moves, how to expose, charge, and actually use the heavy bones of your home so the difference between survival and catastrophe isn't just the size of your gas bill. Thermal mass and insulation are partners, but there's a third player quietly sabotaging both. Invisible wind trapped inside your walls. Picture a typical stud wall in a mountain cabin. Tall, open cavities between 2x4s, a skin of sheathing outside, drywall inside, some fiberglass that looked fluffy and perfect on day one. Now drop that wall into a Montana winter. The outdoor sheathing runs cold. The indoor face is warmed by your stove. That temperature difference sets the stage for a tiny, relentless storm. Here's what happens. Warm air inside the cavity rises along the inner surface, rubs against the cold outer sheathing, cools, sinks, and slides back down. Then it just repeats, over and over, a convective loop, a hidden conveyor belt that strips heat off the back of your interior wall, hands it to the cold exterior, and does it again thousands of times a night. This is normal. This is modern frontier life. Even insulated cabins can leak heat like a sieve if those loops are allowed to run full height, uninterrupted from floor to ceiling. One small gap at the top of the fiberglass, one sag where it settled over 10 winters, and suddenly that big open bay becomes a racetrack for air. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the catalog plans still ignore? He refused to give air a straight shot. Now let's see what Jacob built inside that 18-inch gap. He did not create a single tall chimney where air could rise, cool, and fall in a clean column. He packed in riverstone and sandstone, then poured sand into the cracks. Each stone broke up vertical channels. Each pocket of sand acted like a break. Instead of one big convective loop, you get a maze of tiny sluggish eddies that can't move much heat before it's absorbed by the stone. Those stones were baffles, primitive, heavy, brilliant baffles. The outer log wall still saw the cold. The inner log wall still saw the warm. But the air trapped between them couldn't organize itself into a powerful loop. It just shuffled, slowly, bleeding its energy into 8,000 pounds of mass. Before we reveal the exact technique you can use in a modern house, translate that idea. Today, dense packed cellulose plays a similar role. It fills the stud bay so completely that air can't rise in big streams. It can only wiggle through microscopic paths, losing momentum and heat. Interior baffles, horizontal fire blocking, even a mid-height shelf inside a double stud wall can chop a 6-foot loop into 2 3-foot stubs that move far less energy. Hybrid walls go further, a layer of insulation to slow conduction, then plywood, brick, or interior stone to add mass on the warm side, so any tiny loops that survive are constantly dumping their stolen heat into a thermal battery instead of the outdoors. How do you know if your own walls are hiding these loops? On a cold, windy night, run your hand slowly up the wall between studs. Feel for vertical cold streaks, especially near corners and over-rim joists. Hold a stick of incense near outlets, baseboards, and window trim. Watch the smoke. If it leans or flickers, you're seeing the pressure that feeds those hidden races. Seal the big offenders first. Outlet gaskets, baseboard gaps, the top and bottom of stud bays if you can reach them from the attic or basement. Tighten the leaks without turning your cabin into a sealed jar. You want to starve the loops, not your lungs. Because here's the uncomfortable part. Even if you fix the walls, the largest convective loop in your home isn't in the cavities at all. It's wrapped around you, your stove, and every cold window you own. And that's where Jacob's next move changes the game. That loop around you isn't just heat moving. It's air, water vapor, and every invisible thing your cabin is breathing out. And if you clamp a tight lid on that, the room can be warm on the thermometer and still feel miserably cold to your bones. When modern builders brag about airtight, they're usually talking about energy loss. Less air in, less heat out. But air doesn't just carry heat. It carries moisture from your breath, steam from cooking, combustion gases, and all the tiny pollutants that ride along. Trap that in an absolutely sealed box in the middle of winter, and something ugly happens fast. Moist air drifts toward the coldest surfaces, glass, corners, uninsulated parts of a wall. When that warm, humid air hits a cold pane or a cold log, it condenses. Water beads, frost creeps. That liquid film steals heat far faster than dry air, and the cabin starts to feel clammy, heavy, almost like a damp basement, even at 70 degrees. You've seen this. Fogged windows, black mold in the corners, that faint musty smell. The room is warm, but your skin says no. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of frontier builders kept missing? He refused to let his cabin become a sealed jar. He let it breathe, but on his terms. Now let's see what Jacob built in front of that stone and log wall. He didn't just park a stove in the middle of the room and let it suck heated air off the floor. He cut a dedicated air path, a crude but brilliant inlet that fed cold outside air straight to the firebox. The stove got the oxygen it needed for a fierce, clean burn, but that incoming cold never had a chance to wash across his neighbors' ankles or crawl up their backs. Pattern interrupt. The leak that made his cabin feel warmer was right next to the coldest metal in the room. Instead of dragging frigid air through every crack under every door, Jacob localized the pain. Cold came in, hit the fire, heated up, rose, and left as exhaust. Along the way, that strong combustion stream pulled moisture out. Wet indoor air was constantly being replaced with drier, freshly warmed air, less condensation on the logs, less frost on the glass. A cabin that felt warm and dry, not warm and swampy. Today, we give this frontier hack fancier names. Wood stoves with dedicated combustion air inlets. Heat recovery ventilators. HRVs, that pull stale, moist air out while transferring its heat to incoming fresh air. Tiny, controlled trickle vents at windows that bleed in just enough filtered air instead of letting random cracks decide. Before we reveal the exact technique you can copy, you need one mental shift. There's a difference between leaks and lungs. You absolutely should seal uncontrolled drafts around windows, doors, and outlets. Those are just the mountains stealing your heat. But then you must replace that chaos with intentional filtered airflow that supports both your health and your comfort. Think of your house not as a sealed jar, but as a lung. Deliberate inlets, clear outlets, a slow, steady breath through known paths, the way Jacob's cabin quietly was. In the next part, we'll take that idea one step further and use it to move heat exactly where you want it without burning a single extra log. That slow, steady breath Jacob built into his cabin didn't just move air. It moved sunlight. Now, let's see what Jacob built on the one wall his neighbors barely thought about, the south side. While they punched windows wherever it was convenient, he concentrated almost every precious pane of glass facing the low winter sun, then lined up his heavy stone and dark floorboards right where that light would fall. He turned his walls and floor into a sun-charged thermal battery. South light in a Montana winter looks weak. The air is brutal. The snow squeaks under your boots. But those rays carry real energy. On a clear day, each square foot of south-facing glass can admit hundreds of BTUs of heat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand? That if those rays land on dense, dark material instead of pale, fluffy surfaces, that heat doesn't just flash and vanish. It soaks in. Stone is perfect for this. Dark wood isn't far behind. A sunbeam hitting a thick plank floor or stone hearth near a south window will drive heat into that mass. Then, as the air cools toward evening, that same mass quietly re-radiates warmth back into the cabin. Even in very cold climates, a few hours of clear sun can add several degrees indoors if the energy has somewhere heavy to hide. Here's where this becomes useful to you, even if you're in a modern house and not in the mountains with a log wall and a mule. Before we reveal the exact technique of sizing glass and mass, start simple. Look at your south-facing windows. Are they clean? Are they blocked by thick curtains, tall furniture, or that bookshelf full of paperbacks that never sees the sun? Every layer between the glass and a dark, dense surface is free heat you're handing back to the utility company. Instead, you can quietly copy Jacob. Put a dark rug, stone tile, or even a painted concrete slab where winter sun hits the floor. Place a full bookshelf, a masonry feature, or a heavy table in that sun path, so the mass, not the air, gets charged. Keep those south panes clear during the day, then use insulated curtains at night to hold the heat in. No new furnace, just rearranged physics. But there's a trap. Modern builders love big glass walls, huge unshaded south windows with no interior mass turn your living room into a daytime oven and a nighttime icebox. Overheating at noon, shivering by midnight. Jacob's small panes, thick walls, and heavy interior gave him a natural brake pedal. He captured the sun without being ruled by it. So here's your quiet experiment. Over the next clear winter day, map the sun in your own rooms. Where does it land at 9 a.m., noon, 3 p.m.? Where could you slide a chair, a rug, a stack of dense books or stone so that light hits mass instead of thin air? That small shift can be the difference between survival and catastrophe in a power outage, and a noticeable drop in your heating bill when the grid is fine. Because once you start treating sunlight as fuel, not just daylight, the next question is obvious. How do you move that free heat deeper into the house even after the sun is gone? In the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, a small off-grid cabin has been quietly running a real-world experiment on that question for the last 5 winters. From the outside, it looks ordinary. Metal roof, timber siding, snow drifts halfway up the wall by January. But if you slice that wall open, you would not see the usual thin studs and pink fiberglass. You'd see something that, if you've been paying attention to Jacob, feels eerily familiar. An outer structural wall takes the wind. An inner service wall carries wires and plumbing. Between them, a dense, mass-heavy core, packed not with loose stone this time, but with tightly blown, dense-packed cellulose and layers of fiberboard and wood that together weigh far more than a conventional stud bay. No single thick log, no bare stone, but a deliberate, engineered sandwich of weight. During a typical Colorado winter, with nights dropping below 0 degree and days hovering in the teens, the owners log their numbers. This cabin uses 35 to 45% less heating energy than code-built neighbors with the same floor area. Indoor temperatures swing only 3 to 4 degrees over a 24-hour period. And here's the part that drives the neighbors a little crazy. The family says they feel perfectly warm at 64 degrees on the thermostat, while friends in nearby proper houses complain they're chilled at 70. Why? Because the heat isn't just in the air, it's in the walls around them. Now, let's see what Jacob built, and what these modern builders copied without ever meeting him. Both cabins thicken the wall assembly. Both control how air moves inside that wall, breaking up those convective loops that strip heat away. And both line up their mass, the heavy, heat-storing material, right where people live, sit, and sleep, not buried out in a cold attic or a distant crawl space. In Colorado, the mass is cellulose and wood sheathing instead of riverstone. The outer layer is wrapped in vapor-open membranes that let moisture escape while still blocking wind. Inside, an efficient engineered stove sips cordwood and burns clean, feeding gentle radiant heat into that double wall until the whole cabin feels like one big, low-temperature radiator. Different materials, Same physics Jacob stumbled onto with his bare hands and a pile of stone. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that modern building scientists in fleece vests are now writing conference papers about? That when you combine a reasonably tight shell with real mass in the right place, you get air that feels warmer at lower readings, walls that don't sweat, and a cabin that coasts through cold nights instead of yo-yoing between hot and freezing. To the neighbors, it just looks like that weird, thick-walled place that never seems to have smoke pouring out all day. But to anyone who's been following this story, it's social proof. Jacob's crazy wall wasn't a frontier accident. It was knowledge that's been buried for over a century, and now it's quietly reappearing in some of the most comfortable cabins in the mountains. Before we reveal the exact technique these builders use to charge those walls like a battery, we need to look at what happens when you get the layers wrong and why some thick cabins still feel cold. When you zoom out from Jacob's lonely cabin in the Montana mountains, a strange pattern appears. Men and women who never met him, who never even saw this continent, were quietly playing the same game with heat and cold. Northern Scandinavia, long winters, sun that disappears for weeks. People there built cabins that, on paper, should have been miserable. No plastic vapor barrier, no pink fiberglass, no tidy stud wall with a perfect R value printed on a brochure. They stacked massive pine and spruce logs, 12, 14 inches thick, notched tight at the corners. Small windows punched through that wall like careful wounds, never more glass than the weak winter sun could justify. The forms were compact, almost squat, roofs pitched to shed snow, but not to waste heat to the sky. Inside, the air never rushed. It moved, slowly. Ventilation was not a fan humming in a plastic duct. It was a controllable leak at the eaves, a stovepipe drawing hard, a vent above the cook fire that bled just enough moist air without stripping the cabin bare. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that those Arctic log builders also trusted? That you can't bully winter with thin, fluffy insulation alone. You have to give the heat a place to live. Those heavy log walls worked like Jacob's stone core. During a rare clear day, low sun struck dark floors, iron stoves, the inner faces of the wood. Firelight at night soaked into the mass. The temperature inside didn't spike and crash. It drifted. Slowly. A storm could howl for 3 days, and while the outside plunged, the inside slid only a few degrees at a time. In that climate, that difference between survival and catastrophe was measured in inches of wood and the patience of the wall. Now jump continents. New Mexico desert, high, dry, cold at night. Here, the rebels gave the idea a new skin. Earth ships. Tires rammed full of earth until each one weighed hundreds of pounds, stacked like bricks to form a perimeter wall several feet thick. No stud cavity, no hollow echo, just dense, continuous mass. On the south side, whole walls of glass leaned toward the low winter sun. Behind that glass, interior planters ran. Like green trenches, soil and water acting as both thermal sponge and moisture buffer. Heat poured in during the day, soaked into the tire and earth walls, the floor, the planters, then leaked back out all night while the desert sky froze. Pattern interrupt. These homes, with their dirt-filled tires and jungle-like interiors, often test warmer and more stable than the proper code-approved houses down the road with perfect insulation and humming furnaces. The common thread is not fashion. It's physics. Stone in Jacob's wall, thick logs in Scandinavia, earth-packed tires in New Mexico, they are all slow thermal sponges. They drink in heat when it's available, release it when it's not, and rely on controlled ventilation and deliberate solar gain instead of a fragile plastic membrane. And yet, just like Jacob's crazy cabin, these designs live on the fringes of building codes, politely tolerated or outright frowned on, while many official houses still feel cold and clammy at 68 degrees. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century keeps resurfacing in these outlaw homes. Before we reveal the exact technique modern builders use to charge and control that mass without fighting inspectors, we need to look at how a wall can be both thick and wrongs, and why some heavy houses still bleed heat like a tent. So, what do you do if your walls are already built, the drywall is painted, and there's no way you're tearing your cabin apart down to the studs? You don't need an 18-inch stone core to steal a few of Jacob's advantages. You just need to start treating your existing house like a stubborn mountain man would, as a heat machine, not a decoration. Now let's see what Jacob built in principle, and then miniaturize it. He wrapped himself in mass right where the fire lived. You can echo that without touching a single exterior wall. A thin brick or stone veneer behind a wood stove or along the wall behind a radiator adds a surprising amount of thermal mass. A low masonry half wall beside a stove or a stone bench that the flue runs past becomes a small battery. It charges while the fire is roaring, then leaks warmth back into the room after the flames die and the neighbors' cabins plunge toward freezing. No stove. You can still cheat. Along your cold exterior walls, hide mass in plain sight. Water is dense. It holds serious heat. A row of water-filled containers tucked inside a storage bench or under a window seat or behind a bookcase pressed to that exterior wall quietly soaks up daytime warmth and slows the nighttime temperature drop. It's not pretty on paper, but in a real winter, the difference between survival and catastrophe is rarely about pretty. Then there's air. Jacob never chased perfect airtightness. He chased controlled movement. You can do the same. Seal the obvious stupid leaks, gaps at baseboards, cracks around window frames, icy drafts sneaking through outlets on exterior walls. A tube of caulk and some outlet gaskets can reclaim degrees of heat you're currently donating to the mountains. But, and this is where most modern cabins go wrong, don't choke the building. Create intentional paths. A small, high vent near a stove or in a loft. A controllable grill that lets warm air drift where you want it gives you Jacob-style convection instead of random drafts. What did this stubborn mountain man understand? That a tiny, planned leak near the ceiling is better than a dozen invisible ones at your ankles. You can even rearrange your life inside the existing walls. Pull beds off cold exterior walls so you're not sleeping with your face against a radiator to the outdoors. Move seating closer to any interior masonry or heavy furniture that's been quietly acting as mass. Clear rugs off sunlit floors so the slab or wood can drink in winter light. Those sun patches are free BTUs. Darken the floor where the sun lands with a darker rug or finish. On clear winter days, open the curtains wide, let the low sun rake across the room, then at dusk, drop heavy thermal curtains over the glass to trap that gain. It's crude passive solar, but it's the same knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Let radiation in when it helps. Block conduction when it hurts. These are Jacob moves. Small, thoughtful betrayals of the thermostat number and the insulation label in favor of how heat actually behaves. And once you start feeling that difference, you'll be ready for the next leap. Charging mass on purpose, the way modern outlaw builders do it without a single inspector realizing what changed. So how do you actually think like this man who quietly hacked winter? How do you walk into your own cabin or apartment or suburban living room and see what Jacob saw instead of what the thermostat tells you? Jacob's questions were brutally simple. When I stop feeding the fire, where does the heat go first? Which surfaces feel coldest to my skin, not to a sensor on the wall? And when the weather swings 20 degrees in a day, what parts of the house stay stubbornly the same? Those three questions, asked over and over, were the difference between survival and catastrophe in a Montana winter. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? He wasn't thinking in R values and product brochures. He was thinking in three quiet categories: mass, movement, and sun. Mass first. What in this room can actually store heat? Not the air. Air is fickle. It warms fast, cools faster. It was the stone, the thick log, the heavy floor that mattered to him. Now, let's see what Jacob built, mentally, every time he stepped inside. He scanned for dense surfaces that could be charged by a stove, a south window, or even body heat, then give that warmth back when the fire went cold. Second, movement. How does air and moisture actually move when the fire roars, when it dies, when the wind hits the north? Wall? Are you creating a slow, gentle loop, or a chaotic draft highway? Jacob's double wall calmed the air. No screaming leaks, just tiny, controlled paths. You can feel this in your own place by standing still and noticing where your ankles get hit by invisible rivers of cold. Third, sun. Where does free energy enter, or where could it enter if you stopped fighting it? A south window that never sees a dark, heat-loving surface is wasted. An unused sunlit corner in January is a crime. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century under layers of blinds, curtains, and UV protecting glass. Take that checklist and walk room by room. Mass. Do you have bare, cold exterior walls your shoulder hates to touch? Or bookshelves, rugs, and dense furniture buffering you from the cold? Movement. Can you trace the draft path from that leaky window straight to your couch? Sun. Is the only thing basking in your best winter light a dying houseplant? Notice we haven't touched the thermostat. Jacob wouldn't have cared what the number said if the walls still felt like ice. Before we reveal the exact technique modern outlaw builders use to charge their rooms, you need this shift. Prioritize what your skin feels. Warm surfaces. Smaller temperature swings. Drafts tamed at human level, not just sealed at the roofline. Thinking this way is a quiet rebellion. It ignores code checklists and marketing claims in favor of frontier logic. What keeps a body warm in real mountains, in real cold? And once you start seeing your home through Jacob's eyes, you'll realize you can build a thermal battery without touching a single wall stud. Using tools no inspector would ever notice next. Back in the winter of 1877, those tools weren't theories. They were survival. And slowly, almost grudgingly, the settlement began to orbit around one squat cabin with stone in its walls and heat that didn't die by dawn. At first, the thaw wasn't in the weather. It was in the faces. Men who had laughed in November started showing up in January with the same quiet line. "Figure I'll just warm up a bit, Jacob." Samuel was the worst offender. He'd stomp in, pretend to check on Jacob's health, then hover near that center wall like iron drifting toward a magnet. You can picture it. Outside, the Bridger Mountains locked in -20. Inside, Jacob's cabin at 64. Frost smoking off beards, boots thawing in little puddles on the plank floor, the air still and warm instead of sharp and biting. This was the difference between survival and catastrophe, and they could feel it in their bones. The second time Samuel brought his thermometer, no one jeered. He didn't either. He set one instrument by Jacob's inner log, another near the outer wall, and one just inside his own coat, like he was measuring his pride. Then, quietly, he started taking notes. Morning. Midday. After Jacob. Banked the fire at night. For several days he walked back and forth between cabins, ink freezing on the nib before it hit the paper. His own single-wall cabin sagged in the low 40s before dawn. Jacob's? Mid-50s with cold embers. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? Before we reveal the exact technique in modern terms, watch how the frontier did its peer review. No journals, just neighbors copying what worked. First went the shutters. Rough boards slapped over west windows, hinged with scrap iron, not for privacy, but to trap what little warmth they had. Then stones appeared, ringed around iron stoves in other cabins, a crude imitation of Jacob's massive wall. Not elegant, effective. One family piled earth against the lower logs, muttering that if Jacob could bury his stone, they could bury their cabin. The wind stopped whistling through the floor. The indoor chill eased by a few degrees. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century was, in that moment, just mud and instinct. At the trading post, the tone shifted. The same men who'd called it a German folly now leaned on flour barrels asking different questions. What if we tried something like Jacob's walls on the new barn? You think that stone foundation of his is why his floor ain't freezing? Mockery turned into field notes. Now let's see what Jacob built in their minds. His cabin became the unspoken reference point. When someone said a room was warm, they meant not Jacob warm, but decent. When they talked about building, they talked about mass, about blocking wind, about how long heat lingered after the fire died. By late winter, the cold still ruled the mountains. But in that valley, one quiet, heavy-walled cabin had reset the scale for what warm could mean in a Montana winter. And the rest of the settlement was already, piece by piece, rebuilding around that invisible standard. By the end of that first brutal winter, the valley had done something no university lab ever managed. They had run a live fire building science trial, with real cabins, real families, real consequences when the temperature outside dropped to 20 below and the wind came screaming off the mountains. Think about what was sitting in that little settlement. One neighbor in a classic single-wall log cabin, logs notched and chinked, fire roaring, heat bleeding out the second the flames died. Another trying the new modern stud walls, thin plank siding, an air cavity that looked clever on paper, but turned into a convective highway for cold. A dugout with a sod roof half buried in the hill, damp but buffered by the earth. And then Jacob's heavy double-mass walls, stone-packed between logs like a low-tech thermal battery. Without writing a single measurement down, they were comparing wall assemblies, stoves, and ventilation strategies across an entire winter. Their variables weren't abstract. They were brutal. How fast did frost creep down the inside of the cabin wall before dawn? Did your breath hang in the air at the breakfast table? How many armloads of wood disappeared each day just to keep the children's fingers from going numb? When the thaw came, whose family coughed for weeks and whose didn't? Those were their data points. Frost patterns on the log ends, ice rings in the water bucket, the sound of the wind whistling through a badly notched corner. The way Jacob's cabin stayed warm hours after the last coal went dark while his neighbors were already stumbling back out to the woodpile. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the others were missing? Not formulas, not our values. He understood duration, how long the heat stayed in the cabin when the fire stopped. In a winter like that, the difference between survival and catastrophe was measured in how many hours you could coast. And here's the twist. That messy, lived experiment often reveals truths that lab tests and marketing brochures quietly gloss over. A stud wall filled with fluffy insulation can look perfect in a catalog, but put it through 4 months of sub-zero nights, wind-driven snow, and a leaky stovepipe, and you discover where the theory cracks. Now let's see what Jacob built in modern terms. Today, we run blower door tests to watch air leak through a house. We use thermal imaging cameras to see where heat streaks out through a wall. We log temperatures and humidity for months with sensors. Jacob and his neighbors did the same thing with their skin, their lungs, and their sleep. They felt drafts instead of watching pressure gauges. They read the walls by where frost formed. They tracked wood consumption the hard way, by how fast the pile vanished. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century isn't always hidden in blueprints. Sometimes it's frozen into the memory of which cabin everyone crowded into when the cold hit hardest. And Jacob's numbers, crude as they were, told a story no one could ignore. Modern building codes would have looked at Jacob's cabin and squinted. Where's the insulation? Where are the neat R-value charts, the blower door test results, the tidy checklist that says pass? Today, the system is built around numbers. Minimum R values in the walls and roof. prescribed air tightness, fire clearances, safety margins. Important? Absolutely. But notice what's missing. No line on that form asks, will this actually feel warm at 3 a.m. in a week-long cold? Snap? Codes measure ingredients, not the stew. They reward layers of fluffy insulation you can roll out from a warehouse, plastic vapor barriers stapled in place, and a perfectly sealed envelope that performs well on a one-day test. What they don't directly measure is how a cabin behaves over a brutal winter in the mountains, when the wind turns, the fire dies down, and the cold starts quietly pressing through every surface. Now, let's see what Jacob built and why it doesn't fit neatly into a spreadsheet. A heavy, mass-focused wall like his double log shell packed with stone doesn't show up as a big R value. The math model looks unimpressive. The inspector's chart says, too much thermal bridge, not enough insulation. But reality, sitting there in the mid-50s by morning while the neighbors shiver at 38 degrees, tells a different story. Stone and thick wood slow temperature swings. They store heat, then bleed it back over hours. That's hard to compress into a single number, so the system politely ignores it. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that our modern code books still struggle to quantify? Industry incentives push the other way. Fast, light, repeatable, nail up a stud wall, blow in fiberglass, wrap it in plastic, move on to the next lot. Crews are trained to chase speed, not to stack 8,000 pounds of stone between two log walls, or to wait days while a massive wall charges with heat. There's no line item for patience, no bonus for thick, slow, labor-intensive walls that quietly store a day's worth of fire. So the warmest, most stable cabins often end up at the edge of the conventional paths. Not illegal, just awkward, hard to categorize. Jacob's frontier experiment sits in the same gray zone as many passive solar and thermal mass houses today. Legal, but not exactly what the standard details in the catalog show. Here's where you come in. You should absolutely respect safety and structural codes. You want that chimney clearance, that fire separation, that solid foundation. Those are literally the difference between survival and catastrophe. But you should also be an informed skeptic. Is code minimum insulation really enough for your valley, your wind, your long winter nights? Does a perfectly airtight plastic-wrapped box actually feel warm, or does it feel cold and clammy at 68 Celsius? Before we reveal the exact technique you can use to bring Jacob-style comfort into a modern home, we need to look at one more blind spot in the way we're told to build, and this one hides in plain sight. So let's strip this down. No romance, no legend. Just the raw physics that made one odd cabin in the mountains beat its neighbors by 20 degrees in the dead of winter. Start with conduction. Heat wants to flow from warm to cold, straight through a wall, like water through a thin board. Most frontier cabins gave that heat a direct highway. One layer of log, a smear of mud, then the night. Jacob built a traffic jam. Thick, dense stone packed between two log shells meant every BTU had to fight its way through inches of material that could soak it up, hold it, and only then slowly let it move on. Instead of letting the heat leak away, the wall swallowed it and stored it. That's the first rule. Slow the loss. But conduction wasn't the only thief. Inside a normal stud, wall or log gap, air moves. It forms tall convective loops, hot air racing up, cold air sliding down, quietly stripping heat off the interior surface and handing it to the outside. Think of it as a hidden conveyor belt carrying warmth out of the cabin while you sleep. What did the stubborn mountain man understand that the catalog builders missed? Break the conveyor belt, and you break a huge part of the heat loss. Jacob's stone core did exactly that. The cavities weren't big open chimneys. They were tight, broken-up pockets between irregular stone and rough log. Air could move enough to stay dry and healthy, but not enough to form big, efficient loops. Add a few small, deliberate vents high and low, and you get controlled, gentle convection that keeps moisture from condensing without turning the wall into a heat pump feeding the winter. That's the second rule. Tame the air. Then there's radiation, the part most people ignore. You don't actually feel air temperature first. You feel the radiant temperature of the surfaces around you. Sit next to a cold glass window at 70 degrees Celsius, and you'll still feel chilled. Stand near a warm stone wall at 60 degrees, and your body relaxes. Jacob's inner log and stone surfaces, charged by days of fire and a low winter sun, sat right at human height, quietly beaming infrared back into the room and into anyone sitting near the wall. Suddenly, 64 degrees feels like 72 degrees. Less wood, more comfort. Now, let's see what Jacob built into the sky side of his cabin. Those south-facing windows weren't just for light. On clear days, they poured solar gain straight into the stone, turning the wall into a daylight charger that kept releasing heat long after dark. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century, glass plus mass equals free evening warmth. So here's the simple mental model. Slow the loss with dense material, store the surplus in that mass, and aim the warmth by radiation and solar gain right where people actually live in the room. In a harsh mountain winter, that difference between survival and catastrophe can be as small as a few degrees. In the next part, we'll take that model and translate it into exact, buildable details you can use today, without hauling 8,000 pounds of river stone into your living room. So let's do something Jacob never had, a safe place to experiment. No blizzards, no neighbors laughing over your shoulder, just you, a blank page, and a question. If you could design a wrong cabin on paper, one that ignored fashion but obeyed the physics he proved in those mountains, what would it look like? Not the catalog plan, not the glossy timber frame brochure. Your cabin, compact, dense, deliberate. Now let's see what Jacob built and then quietly steal the principles. In your mind, shrink the footprint until it's almost inconvenient. Fewer corners, fewer wings, fewer places for heat to leak away into the night. A simple rectangle or square that hugs its own warmth, the way his double log wall hugged that 8,000 pounds of stone. You're not chasing floor area. You're chasing evenings where you can sit in a shirt while the world outside is locked in winter. Then, the real question, where do you put the mass? What did this stubborn mountain man understand about weight and warmth that modern plans hide behind fiberglass and vapor barriers? Do you imagine an interior stone wall running down the spine of the cabin, acting like a slow, steady radiator? Earth and plaster over lath on the cold exterior walls, turning flimsy surfaces into heat banks. A masonry heater in the center, thick as a small car, sipping wood and bleeding out comfort for hours after the fire goes dark. Or maybe you're subtler, built-in bookshelves, floor to ceiling, on that north wall that always feels like a ghost is leaning on it. Hundreds of pounds of paper and wood, quietly adding density, smoothing out the temperature swings that drive most cabins from hot to cold in a single night. This is how you think like Jacob. Every surface asks, will I help store heat or throw it away? Then you decide where air is allowed in and where it is not. No more random nail-hole breezes. Picture a dedicated combustion air inlet right to the stove, so it feeds on outside cold instead of stealing your room's warmth. Imagine a small, high vent you can crack to bleed moisture and smoke after cooking. Maybe even a simple HRV box on the wall, trading stale indoor air for fresh without dumping all your hard-earned heat into the sky. Controlled leaks, not accidental ones. Now track the sun. Stand in that imaginary cabin on a January morning. Which wall catches the low southern light? Do you put your main living area there, with moderate, well-shaded glass that soaks up winter sun but doesn't turn July into an oven? Do you keep the big, impressive picture window off the north side, where it would act like a cold radiator all night long? Jacob didn't have solar charts, but he had eyes, and he knew where the snow melted first. This isn't about drawing a perfect blueprint. It's about reprogramming your instincts. To see a cabin not as a fashion object or an R-value spreadsheet, but as a life support shell that trades in real comfort and resilience. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is suddenly back on the table, and you get to test it with a pencil instead of your toes in 22-degree air. Hold that mental cabin in place, because in the next section, we'll stop imagining and start translating these choices into specific wall layers, real materials, and small, almost invisible tweaks that can shift your winter from endurance to ease. Hold that mental cabin in place, and now zoom out. Because the moment you step from Jacob's stone-heavy walls into the modern building industry, you run into a very different kind of wall. Marketing. Insulation is perfect for it. Neat, lightweight, compressible. You can roll it, wrap it, spray it, and ship it by the truckload. One number on the front of the bag, R13, R21, R38, and the promise is clear. Higher number, more heat saved, happier winter. Simple charts, simple codes, simple sales. Thermal mass? That is a nightmare for a brochure. Now, let's see what Jacob built in that context. His cabin's performance came from 8,000 pounds of stone buried inside a double wall. No barcode, no bright logo, no contractor upsell where they say, "We'll just blow in 6 more inches for you." You cannot ship river rock in pink plastic and stack it at the home center next to caulk guns and foam cans. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that the catalog never tells you? That in a real mountain winter, comfort is not just about slowing heat loss for an hour. It is about storing energy for the entire night. But you cannot print thermal lag on a sticker and sell it in rolls. Insulation products fit beautifully into regulation. Inspectors can check cavity depth, glance at an R value, tick a box. Energy codes are written around those numbers. Rebates are structured around those numbers. Whole incentive programs rise and fall on whether you add more fluffy material between skinny studs. No one has to visit your site and ask, "How much stone did you bury in this wall, and how is the sun hitting it in January?" Mass, by contrast, is stubbornly local, heavy, site-specific. The stone in Jacob's Valley is not the brick in your city or the adobe in a New Mexico village. The way it holds heat depends on orientation, climate, and how the rest of the cabin is built. That makes it hard to standardize, hard to regulate, and very hard to turn into a national product line, so most homeowners never even hear the question. They are taught to think in inches of insulation, not in pounds of wall. They get a menu of quick-fix upgrades. Blow this into your attic, spray that into your rim joist, seal every crack until the cabin cannot breathe. Thermal mass strategies, thick interior stone, heavy floors, dense inner walls that charge during the day, rarely appear in the glossy pamphlets. This is not a cartoon villain conspiracy. No shadowy executive sat in a boardroom and banned stone from the mountains. It is a structural bias. What is easy to sell, ship, and regulate floats to the top. What is slow, contextual, and tied to place, like Jacob's Riverstone core, sinks out of view. But knowledge that's been buried for over a century does not stop working just because the catalog ignores it. The physics in those walls still cares only about density, temperature, and time. Insulation and mass are not rival religions. They are tools. Fiberglass slows the leak. Stone and heavy timber smooth the swing. Jacob's cabin is proof that mass deserves a seat at the table. The difference between survival and catastrophe in that 1876 winter was not an extra inch of fluff. It was 8,000 pounds of silent, patient stone holding the day's fire into the night. So the real question is this: If the warmest cabin in the valley was built around a principle the modern market barely mentions, what else have we been trained not to see in our walls? In the next section, we'll pull that bias apart layer by layer, and you'll discover how a few strategic pounds in the right place can overturn everything you've been told about proper insulation. So let's turn that hidden bias into something you can actually use when the wind starts howling at your own windows. Now let's see what Jacob built, not as a museum piece, but as a checklist. A way to walk through your cabin, your house, your tiny apartment, and quietly ask, where could I steal the same advantage this stubborn mountain man understood about heat and cold in the mountains? First principle, add mass where you sit and sleep, not randomly, at body height. Jacob wrapped his living space in stone right where people actually lived their winter days and nights. For you, that can mean a dense feature wall on your coldest side, a brick or stone veneer behind the stove, or even floor-to-ceiling bookshelves loaded with real books along that icy north wall. The goal isn't decoration. It's a slow, heavy heat reservoir right next to your skin. Second principle, smooth the temperature swings. Jacob's stone didn't make the cabin hot. It made it steady. Less roller coasters, more slow train. You can echo that with a small masonry hearth around a wood stove, a concrete or tile floor patch where the sun hits in the afternoon, or a thick, dark table that soaks up those few precious hours of winter light. Each added chunk of mass trims the peaks and fills in the valleys. Third principle, aim for warm surfaces, not just warm air. His neighbors chased air temperature. Jacob warmed the walls. That's why 64 degrees in his cabin felt comfortable, while 45 degrees in theirs felt like punishment. You can shift in that direction by insulating the coldest interior surfaces you actually touch, hanging insulated curtains over leaky glass, or adding a thin, continuous layer of foam or cork behind a bed that sits on an exterior wall. If the surface your body sees is warmer, the whole room feels different. Fourth principle, control, don't eliminate, airflow. Before we reveal the exact technique of modern airtight construction, remember, Jacob's cabin leaked in the right places. Tiny, deliberate paths for fresh air, tight where the wind attacked. For you, that might mean sealing the wild gaps at the sill and outlets while adding a small controlled vent near the stove or a trickle vent at a high window. You want gentle, predictable convection inside, not random drafts. Pattern interrupt. You do not need to rebuild your walls. Pick 1 or 2 moves this winter, not 10. 1 new mass feature where you actually live. 1 smarter airflow tweak. That's it. Jacob didn't. Nail perfection on day 1. He watched frost, smoke, and his own breath, then adjusted. Observation and survival. Iteration by iteration. Because knowledge that's been buried for over a century is only useful if it changes what you do before the next deep freeze. In the next section, we'll pull these principles into a simple winter game plan and show you how to tell within 1 cold night whether your changes are the difference between survival and catastrophe or just another nice idea on paper. So what did all of this actually prove once the snow melted and the ledgers came out? In one brutal winter, up in those Montana mountains, a stubborn immigrant with an accent and a wrong cabin quietly rewrote the rules. Jacob Reinhardt built against every recommendation, ignored the catalog plans, shrugged off the neighbors' eye rolls, and then spent the coldest winter in decades walking around in his shirt sleeves while they slept in coats. Now let's see what Jacob built, not as a legend, but as a measured experiment. The numbers weren't vague. Neighbors with single log walls, big stoves, and proper chinking were fighting to keep their cabins in the high 30s at dawn. Thermometers on their tables read 36 degrees, sometimes 38 degrees, with frost on the inside of the walls and breath hanging in the air. Jacob's cabin. Evening readings at 64 to 68 degrees. Mornings in the mid-50s with the firestone cold. Same mountains, same wind, same winter. And he did it burning half the wood. While other families tore through 2.4 to 2.8 cords a week, Jacob's pile dropped by about 1.2. Less time cutting and hauling in the freezing dark. Fewer drafts knifing across the floor. His walls stayed warm to the touch hours after the last log had collapsed into coals. That is the difference between survival and catastrophe when the temperature sits at 22 below for days. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the experts didn't? He didn't know equations. He knew behavior. He watched how heat moved, where the cold settled, how stone felt at midnight compared to raw log. So he built double walls with mass in between, 2 log shells 18 inches apart, packed with nearly 4 tons of riverstone and sandstone up to human height. He left strategic gaps so air could slide gently through the cavity, warming against stone without turning into a draft, and he pushed his warmth right where people actually lived, from the floor to about 7 feet. He turned the south side of that cabin into a quiet ally. South-facing glass, small but deliberate, let in low winter sun that charged those heavy walls during the day. Dark interior surfaces soaked up radiation instead of bouncing it away. At night, those same walls bled it back hour after hour as if an invisible stove was still running. Now pull that into your world. When you talk insulation today, you think fiberglass, spray foam, vapor barriers, airtight ratings. But how often do you think about mass, about where the glass goes, about whether your tight cabin is actually clammy and cold once the thermostat shuts off? Jacob's cabin says, put your real R value where your body is. Use interior brick, stone, or even water tanks as thermal batteries. Aim your biggest panes of glass south, not west. Ventilate on purpose with tiny, controlled leaks instead of random cracks that steal your heat. What did Jacob know that we don't? Only this. The cold doesn't care about fashion or rules, it only obeys physics. He respected how heat really behaves, and built for that. In the next section, we'll turn that respect into a step-by-step winter test you can run in a single night to see whether your own walls are allies or enemies. So now it's your turn to find out whether your walls are on your side or quietly working for the cold, not in theory. In your own cabin, your own living room, your own 4 walls this winter. Because what did this stubborn mountain man understand that most of us still ignore? That comfort is not a thermostat setting. Comfort is how the room behaves over time. Here's the challenge. Pick one room, one space you actually care about when the wind comes down off the mountains. Then run a Jacob-style experiment on it. Add a little mass, move a chair, crack a vent, and don't guess. Measure. You don't need a lab. A $10 digital thermometer with a memory function will do. Put it at about chest height away from direct sun. For 2 or 3 cold nights, record the temperature every hour, or let the logger do it. Watch what happens when the heat source goes off. Does the room crash 10 degrees in 45 minutes? Or does it glide down slowly, like Jacob's stone-filled wall, coasting through the night? Next, change one thing. Stack a row of bricks or pavers behind a small stove. Lay a few concrete blocks under a south-facing window where the low winter sun can hit. Hang a heavy bookcase on an interior wall near the heat. You're not rebuilding the cabin. You're giving it a small thermal battery and seeing if the curve on your thermometer softens. Then try the controlled leak Jacob would recognize. Instead of random cracks that steal your heat, crack a high window or a dedicated vent a 1/4 inch while sealing obvious drafts at floor level. Does the room feel less clammy at the same temperature? Do the windows stop crying with condensation? That's the difference between survival and catastrophe in a long, wet winter. Now, let's see what Jacob built. In your comments section, post your readings. Started at 70 degrees, dropped to 58 in 4 hours after adding 200 lb of brick. Tell us how it felt. Toes, nose, back of the neck. If you try a Jacob-inspired tweak, throw in a photo. We want to see your improvised stone corners, your makeshift mass walls, your experiments in real heat. If you care about real comfort, not just marketing, claims and fluffy R numbers, hit like and subscribe. That tells the algorithm you're part of a different crowd. People who want knowledge that's been buried for over a century, not the same brochure-grade advice that left Jacob's neighbors shivering in their proper cabins. And if you know someone planning a cabin, a tiny house, or a big renovation, send this to them before they lock in their walls. One link now could save them decades of cold winters and high fuel bills. Because we're just getting started. Next, we're going deeper into masonry heaters, earth-berm designs, and even viewer-submitted wrong cabins that turned out to be right. One of those strange designs might break the biggest heating rule you still trust, and you won't want to discover that gap in a blizzard. Granite from the river, timber from the slope, knowledge that's been buried for over a century, sitting there in plain sight in one quiet cabin on a Montana ridge. Late winter, 1877. The blizzards have broken, but the cold hasn't forgiven yet. Dawn comes blue and brittle over the mountains, snow piled waist-deep against every wall, every cabin half buried in a frozen sea. Smoke hangs low over the valley, thin and gray, dragged down by air that bites exposed skin in seconds. A door latch lifts. Jacob Reinhardt steps out into that blue world, breath pluming, boots crunching through a crust of ice. Behind him, his cabin door hangs open a moment too long, and you can see it. A slow exhale of warm air, not a frantic rush. The kind of heat that doesn't panic when the door opens. The kind that has time. Now, let's see what Jacob built. The camera pulls back. His walls are thick, almost clumsy at first glance, the double log shell riding on that deep stone foundation. Snow is heaped against the outer wall, but it doesn't matter. The real work is happening inside that 18-inch cavity, where 8,000 pounds of stone have been quietly drinking up heat all night and leaking it back teaspoon by teaspoon into the room. Across the draw, other cabins tell a different story. Frost rims every window, lace patterns creeping in from the corners. Smoke from overworked stoves claws at the sky. Thin, fast, desperate. You can almost hear the cough of damp wood and undersized chimneys. Doors crack open and tired figures step out, already hauling armloads of logs before the sun has cleared the ridge. Their fires never really stop. Their walls never really help. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? He understood that in a long winter, the difference between survival and catastrophe isn't one more armload of wood. It's a wall that cooperates with you. A cabin that holds on to yesterday's fire like a memory. The camera drifts back to Jacob's place. Small south windows catching the first week light, thick walls, no frost at the glass. Inside, you can almost feel it through the lens. Air that's calm, steady, in the mid-50s before the morning fire, while his neighbors are waking up to 38 degrees and ice in the wash basin. It's as if the cabin itself is alive against the cold, pulsing with stored heat long after the last ember fades. Now, shift that image to your own home. Imagine the furnace clicking off, and the room doesn't instantly cool. Imagine a power outage, a dead thermostat, a silent stove, and your walls quietly bleeding warmth back into the air for hours. No rush, no panic, just a calm, forgiving buffer between you and the weather. Because that's the real lesson hiding in this little log cabin. Not nostalgia, not romance. A practical question: are your walls working for you or against you? As the frame widens, Jacob shoulders his axe, but he's not racing the cold. His cabin bought him time. Warmth bought with thought instead of just fuel. And as the snowfield fades to white, remember this. Sometimes the warmest place on the mountain belongs to the one person willing to ignore the rules and listen to the cold instead. If you're ready to make your own walls smarter, not just thicker, Keep digging, because the next winter you face shouldn't be a test you take unprepared,